Plato's Republic. An Introduction. Sean McAleer. Introduction. Plato's Republic is one of those books that most people have probably heard of, even if they have not actually read it. Even Bubbles, the good-hearted, bespectacled doofus of the long-running Canadian comedy Trailer Park Boys, knows enough of the Republic to appeal to the famous noble lie in a conversation with another resident of Sunnyvale Trailer Park. I first encountered the Republic, like so many others have, in my first semester of college. This was many years ago, but my memory of the experience was one of feeling lost much of the time. I had a fine high school education, but philosophy was new to me, with its focus on big, abstract questions and especially on rigorous, rational arguments as the means to answering them. I did reasonably well in the course, but the Republic was tricky terrain, and I did not really know my way about. My aim in this book is to help readers traverse Plato's philosophical masterpiece with fewer falls and less befuddled wandering than I experienced. I try to do this by pointing out important landmarks and interesting bits of topography, helping readers not to miss the forest for the trees, as the saying goes, but also to appreciate the importance of particular trees, hills, and streams. I consider objections to the views and arguments of Plato has Socrates express and make. Thinking philosophically requires, among other things, stating arguments clearly and carefully, articulating assumptions that lurk in the background, and making judgments, hopefully, good judgments about whether the reasons offered in support of a claim are good reasons. The Republic's two main questions. The Republic addresses two overarching questions: what is justice? And is a just life happier, more profitable, or personally advantageous than an unjust life? Plato addresses these questions in what is for modern readers an unexpected way, in dialogue form. Instead of writing an essay or a treatise directly arguing for his view, he gives us a philosophical drama, so to speak, a conversation between Socrates and several others in which answers are offered, discussed, and typically rejected. Plato wrote almost all of his philosophy as dialogues, most of them featuring Socrates talking with someone he would encounter in Athens, though Plato's later dialogues no longer feature Socrates. Plato was not Socrates' student in a formal sense, since Socrates himself wrote nothing and started no school, unlike Plato, who founded the Academy, where Aristotle studied before founding his own school, the Lyceum. But like many young men of his day, Plato was taken with Socrates, struck by his sharp and open mind and his fearless but often failed pursuit of knowledge. Whether the views the character Socrates expresses in the Republic are his own or whether Plato uses him to express his own views is an interesting issue, but it is not one that we need worry over to come to terms with the Republic. I will usually make no distinction between Plato and Socrates in this book, except when doing so helps our understanding, as when, for example, Socrates seems to make an error in reasoning or allows a crucial assumption to pass unquestioned. Is the mistake one that Plato himself does not recognize? Or does he intentionally have Socrates stumble or pull a fast one because this is what actually happened in the conversation, of which the dialogue is a faithful but stylized representation? Or more likely, I think because he wants us, his readers, to engage in imaginary dialogue with Socrates, to raise objections and questions where the other characters are silent or too agreeable? That Plato writes philosophy in dialogue form complicates the life of the reader, but it is a complication that is rich and rewarding, and also enables Plato to manifest respect for his readers. His aim is not the transmission of truth or doctrine from the knowing sage to a passive but receptive learner. Indeed, in presenting the famous allegory of the cave, he explicitly rejects the idea that education is putting knowledge into souls that lack it, like putting sight into blind eyes. Instead, we are expected to be active, engaged readers who wrestle with the questions and arguments for ourselves. Writing dialogue suggests that philosophy, which I take to be clear, rigorous thinking about those important questions that are outside the ambit of the natural or social sciences, is best done in conversation with others rather than alone in one's study. Readers with some familiarity with philosophy will not be surprised that one of our first tasks in trying to understand how Plato has Socrates answer the Republic's two main questions is to question the questions themselves. What exactly does Plato mean when he asks about the nature of justice and whether it is more profitable than injustice? An important point straightaway is that delta iota kappa alpha iota omicron sigma nu eta, dikaiosun, which is translated as justice, can have broader meaning than the English word justice has, which typically involves fair distributions or the idea of rights. Dikaiosun certainly has this narrower sense too. In Book 5 of his Nicomachean Ethics, Plato's student Aristotle distinguishes between specific and general senses of justice, where specific justice concerns what today we would call distributive justice, which asks whether a particular distribution of goods is fair, and retributive justice, which asks if and how wrongdoers should be punished. The broader sense that Plato has in mind connotes moral goodness more generally, a virtue of doing the right thing, but we will ultimately see that for Plato justice is primarily about being a certain sort of person rather than doing certain kinds of things. Justice in this broad sense might be rendered by righteousness, but that seems rather archaic and can have misleading religious connotations. Aristotle suggests that justice in this general sense is complete virtue, the whole of virtue, of which the narrower kind of justice is a part. When Socrates asks what justice is, he is asking about the nature of moral goodness generally, asking what is it to be a good person. The Republic's second question asks whether being a good person makes one personally better off, whether it would make living most worthwhile for each of us. There is no question of whether a just life is morally better than an unjust life. The issue the second question raises, by contrast, is whether a just life is prudentially better, as philosophers often put it, whether it is in one's interest to be just and act justly. This question has great practical importance, given the overwhelmingly plausible assumption that each of us wants to be happy. As Socrates puts it, the argument concerns no ordinary topic but the way we ought to live. In ordinary English, there is a subtle distinction between leading a good life and having a good life. At the funeral of a friend who is devoted to the well-being of others, we expect the eulogy to focus on the former. They led a good life, helping others without thought of self and often to their own detriment. At the funeral of a friend devoted to the pleasures of the table and the bedroom, we are likelier to hear that they had a good life. So the Republic's second question inquires about the connection between leading a good life and having a good life. It is a comparative question, asking if the just person is happier than the unjust person. Socrates is not arguing that justice is sufficient for happiness, that being just alone makes for a happy life. Instead, he will argue that justice is necessary for happiness, that we cannot be happy without being just. Socrates thinks that justice alone will not guarantee happiness, since there may be external circumstances that make happiness impossible, even for the just person. But the just or morally good person will be as happy as it is possible to be in those circumstances and always be happier than the unjust person, since justice always makes one better off than injustice, he thinks. As we follow along, it will be helpful to bear in mind ways in which happiness can be a misleading translation for the Greek word epsilon delta alpha iota mu omicron nu alpha, eudaimonia, which connotes flourishing or thriving, something deeper and longer lasting than the perhaps fleeting psychological state of enjoyment that we might associate with our word happiness. A flourishing person will typically enjoy their life, but the enjoyment is best thought of as a byproduct of happiness rather than its essence. The structure of the Republic. The Republic's two main questions give it its structure, which I sketch here. Book 1 introduces but ultimately fails to answer the Republic's two main questions. Socrates discusses the nature and value of justice first with Cephalus and Polemarchus, and then with Thrasymachus, a more sophisticated and less friendly interlocutor. Socrates initially thinks that he has refuted Thrasymachus' view that the unjust life is happier than the just life, but he soon realizes that he has left the Republic's first question unanswered, and thus that he has not really answered the second question. How could he know which life is happier if he does not yet know what justice is? Books 2 to 4 answer the Republic's first question, what is justice? Socrates' young friends Glaucon and Adeimantus, who in real life are Plato's brothers, challenge Socrates to continue after the failure of Book 1. They agree with him that the just life is happier than the unjust life, but they recognize that they cannot justify their view and thus do not really know that the just life is more profitable. They press Socrates to forego the rapid-fire argumentation of Book 1 and to offer a more intuitive, accessible way of answering the Republic's questions. Although these questions concern justice as a virtue of persons, which we'll call personal justice, Socrates suggests that, since a polis, a Greek city-state, is just like a person, only bigger, the best way to figure out the nature of personal justice is to investigate justice in the polis, political justice, since it will be easier to find justice in the larger thing. Thus they set out to theoretically construct an ideal polis, which is completed by the end of Book 3. And by the end of Book 4, Socrates thinks he has answered the first question and starts on the second. In Books v7, Socrates answers questions about and objections to his answer to the Republic's first question. These are dubbed the three waves, since they threaten to destroy the ideal city. The first wave concerns whether women can be rulers in the ideal polis. Socrates' view on this might surprise you. The second addresses the ideal city's communal life, especially how children are to be raised, which seems to do away with the traditional family. The third and most threatening concerns the ideal polis itself. Is their ideal city merely theoretical, or could it be realized in the actual world? Socrates thinks such a city can be realized only if it is ruled by philosophers, which leads to an investigation of what a philosopher is. This investigation will last through Book 7. In addressing the third wave, Plato has Socrates introduce the famous theory of the forms and offer one of the Republic's central arguments, the powers argument. In defense of this view, he presents the analogies of the sun and the divided line in Book 6, and the famous allegory of the cave in Book 7, among other things. Having addressed the three waves to the company's satisfaction, in Books 8 to 9 Socrates turns to the Republic's second question: is the just life happier than the unjust life? Expanding on the psychology and political philosophy developed earlier, he distinguishes between 5 possible kinds of souls and city-states and argues that the just life is happier than the unjust life. Having answered the Republic's 2 questions, in Book 10 Socrates returns to the status of poetry, which featured prominently in the educational program sketched in Books 2 and 3. Despite his love for poetry, especially the works of Homer, he argues that most poetry should not be allowed in the ideal city because of its power to corrupt us. He concludes with the intriguing myth of air, about the importance of choice in a happy, well-lived life. Readers will often find it helpful to keep the Republic's overall structure in mind while making their way through the text, since what a character is talking about often makes more sense when we understand why they are talking about it. So it can be helpful, when feeling a little lost, to orient oneself by asking which question of the Republic's 2 main questions is being addressed, although it might take a bit of intellectual sleuthing to determine that. For example, the details of the educational program Socrates develops in Books 2 and 3 are interesting in their own right, but it is easy to lose sight of why he devotes so much time and intellectual energy to this topic. If we keep the Republic's overall structure in mind, we can see that Socrates discusses education and culture because he is exploring what an ideal polis is like, which requires an understanding of how the polis's rulers will be educated. And of course, he wants to create this ideal polis because the plan is to define political justice in order to define personal justice. And while the Republic's first question about the nature of personal justice is interesting in its own right, Socrates wants to answer it because, as he realizes at the end of Book 1, we cannot satisfactorily answer the Republic's second question about whether the just life is happier until we know what justice is. As orienting oneself by overall structure is an aid to understanding, I will try to offer signposts and reminders as we proceed through the Republic. Shortly, I will offer more detail about what individual chapters of this book will contain, but before doing that I want to draw the reader's attention to one more big-picture topic. Arguing about justice. Thrasymachus, Socrates' main antagonist in the second half of Book 1, thinks that justice and happiness are at odds with each other, that being just and acting justly leave one worse off. Socrates disagrees, and it is instructive to see what he does and does not do in the face of this disagreement. First, what he does not do: he does not insult Thrasymachus or impugn his intelligence or his motives. Sadly, the same cannot be said for Thrasymachus, who responds to Socrates' arguments in a rather nasty way. Nor does Socrates shrug and say things like, "Everyone's got a right to their opinion, I guess," or "who's to say," or "that's just your opinion, man," like a Lebowski of classical antiquity who has traded his bathrobe for a chiton. The ancient Greeks did not wear togas, that was a Roman thing. Socrates does not think that reason merely sheds light on the Republic's main questions, he thinks it can answer them. Some readers will be less confident in the power of rational argument and conceptual clarity. They may be more comfortable than Socrates and Plato are with there being more than one correct answer to these questions or with there being none. But even though Socrates himself is not a moral pluralist, it is important to see that the method he employs in arguing against Thrasymachus is consistent with there being a plurality of answers to moral questions of the sort that the Republic devotes itself to. For while Socrates' method of question and answer, formally called elenchus, a kind of cross-examination, is impersonal in the sense of focusing on principles rather than personalities, it is in another sense profoundly personal, for its focus is what the person he is engaging with thinks. The best way to investigate the nature of justice, he thinks, is to critically examine the views of someone who claims to know what justice is, to see if such a view can survive rigorous cross-examination and coherently hang together. So he proceeds from premises that his interlocutors endorse. Although Socrates thinks that there is an Archimedean point from which one can definitively settle moral questions, the Socratic method of question and answer does not presuppose this exalted view of reason. Its aim is more modest, to discover whether one's philosophical and moral beliefs are internally consistent. While this method is no respecter of persons in that it does not defer to someone based upon their social class, etc., it is, I think, profoundly respectful of persons, since it takes seriously a person's moral and philosophical views. Even though these views are usually found wanting, a willingness to examine a person's views about the nature of justice or courage or knowledge or whatever is certainly a way of taking those views, and that person, seriously. What to expect in this book? This book is not a line-by-line commentary of the Republic, but it hews closely to the main contours of the Republic. I intend it as an aid to reading the Republic rather than as a substitute for doing so. In the chapters to come, I try to guide readers, especially those new to the Republic or returning to it after a long absence, to a clear understanding of the Republic's main themes and distinctive arguments. But we will also pause to linger over details that are interesting in themselves and which contribute to a nuanced understanding of Plato's philosophical thought and literary artistry. I will try to clearly and accurately spell out the arguments Plato has Socrates offer and then critically reflect on them, asking questions such as, does the conclusion logically follow from the premises, and do we have good reasons to think the premises are true, and what assumptions are driving the argument, etc. We will see that Socrates' interlocutors often accept arguments that they have good reason to doubt. This is something most of us do, especially when we think the conclusion is true, but setting aside one's belief in a conclusion and querying the quality of the reasons offered in support of it is the hallmark of good critical thinking. I will try to model that in the pages to come and hopefully help readers sharpen their own philosophical skills. Since one of Plato's aims is for us, his readers, to think philosophically for ourselves, nothing would delight me more than readers disagreeing with and arguing against claims, interpretations, and assessments I make. Needless to say, there is a lot I will leave out as we proceed through the Republic, but by the end readers should have a good sense of the main themes and arguments of the Republic and of some of the philosophical problems with them. Here is a chapter-by-chapter rundown of the main issues to be discussed. Chapter 1, Fathers and Sons, covers the first half of Book 1 of the Republic, where Socrates raises the Republic's first question about the nature of justice at the home of Cephalus, a wealthy merchant who lives in a suburb of Athens. Cephalus suggests that justice is paying one's debts and telling the truth, but Socrates thinks this cannot be the essence of justice, since there are times when one should not return what one has borrowed. This alerts us to an important fact about what Socrates is looking for in an account of justice. The account should be unconditionally correct, with no ifs, ands, or buts. Cephalus' son Polemarchus jumps into the conversation and offers a revision of his father's definition, suggesting that justice-right conduct generally is benefiting one's friends and harming one's enemies. Socrates finds this account has implications that Polemarchus himself cannot accept, so the chapter explores Socrates' reasoning, especially the assumption that justice, a virtue of character, is a craft or skill. We then discuss Socrates' more direct argument against Polemarchus' account, that the just person would not harm anyone. Chapter 2, Taming the Beast, Socrates versus Thrasymachus, is devoted to Socrates' encounter with the sophist Thrasymachus in the second half of Book 1. Thrasymachus' answers to the Republic's main questions are a provocative challenge to the reverential attitude Socrates has toward justice in particular and virtue in general. Thrasymachus defines justice as whatever benefits the politically powerful and argues that a conventionally just person lives less happily than their unjust counterpart. Socrates offers 5 different arguments against Thrasymachus' views, which are spelled out clearly and evaluated carefully, with attention paid to the connections between them and to the crucial concepts around which they orbit, example, the notion of a virtue. Socrates' arguments fall short of the mark, and we will examine why this is the case, exploring avenues of response that Thrasymachus could but does not take. By the close of Book 1, Socrates realizes that he has not answered the Republic's second question because he has not yet answered the first. We cannot know whether the just life is happier until we first know what justice is. Chapter 3, A Fresh Start, explores the way in which Socrates tries to address the Republic's 2 questions: what is justice, and is the just life happier than the unjust life? Rather than offering a battery of arguments as he did in Book 1, Socrates offers an analogy between the polis, the Greek city-state, and the psyche, individual soul, that will structure the rest of the Republic. The plan is to first discover the nature of justice as a political virtue, as a virtue of the polis, and then apply this to the individual soul in order to discover the nature of personal justice. Chapter 4, Blueprints for a Platonic Utopia, Education and Culture, examines Socrates' account of education in the ideal polis, focusing especially on informal, cultural education in music and poetry. We will explore the fascinating connection Socrates draws between aesthetic and moral development, especially the role that poetic and musical style play over and above content. We then discuss Socrates' rather disturbing attitude toward disabled citizens before focusing on the famous noble falsehood, which concludes Book 3, discussing the role that myth, especially myths of origin, play in civic self-understanding. Chapter 5, starting to answer the first question, the political virtues, focuses on the first third of Book 4. The ideal polis complete, Socrates and company investigate the political virtues of wisdom, courage, moderation, and justice, defining each and discussing their location in the polis. We will explore these accounts and the issues they raise, for example, how the kind of agreement that constitutes political moderation differs from the idea of consent in modern liberal political thought, and the question of whether there are other virtues in addition to the 4 cardinal virtues. We continued discussing Book 4 of the Republic in Chapter 6, the Republic's first question answered at last, personal justice. We first attend to Plato's foray into psychology, literally, his account, logos, of the soul, sush, in which he tries to justify the analogy between city and soul that has shaped the Republic. By appealing to the idea that the same thing cannot simultaneously undergo or perform opposite states or activities, dubbed the opposition principle, Socrates argues that the soul has a 3-part structure, just as the city does: a rational part, which corresponds to the guardian rulers in the polis, a spirited part, the seat of anger and pride, which corresponds to the soldierly auxiliaries of the polis, and an appetitive part, which corresponds to the craftspeople. Socrates then derives the personal virtues by applying the political virtues to the soul. The most important personal virtue, of course, is justice, which he conceives of as each part of the soul doing its own work. Reason, not appetite or spirit, governs the just soul. We will pay attention to important features of this account, for example how it differs from Cephalus and Polemarchus, for whom justice is a matter of interpersonal, external doing, of how one treats one's fellows, while for Socrates and Plato is it a matter of intrapersonal, internal being, of what one's soul is like. In Chapter 7, Questions about the Ideal Polis, the 3 Waves, we see Polemarchus and Adeimantus begin Book 5 by putting the brakes on Socrates' attempt to immediately begin answering the Republic's second question, whether living a morally good life is good for the person living it. They raise questions about and objections to the ideal polis, known as the 3 Waves, which is an apt metaphor for a seafaring culture. The first wave concerns the question of whether women can be guardian rulers in the ideal city. Socrates' affirmative answer, surprising to his companions and to many readers alike, though for different reasons, raises the question of whether Plato is a feminist. The second wave concerns the ideal city's communal living arrangements, especially child-rearing. Socrates argues that not only is the abolition of the traditional family possible, it is beneficial. The third wave is the subject of the next chapter. Chapter 8, Surfing the Third Wave, Plato's metaphysical elevator, the powers argument, and the infallibility of knowledge, focuses on the third wave, which concerns the very possibility of the ideal city. Socrates famously claims that the ideal city can be made real only if philosophers rule. This leads him to explore how philosophers differ from non-philosophers, which will guide the last part of Book 5, as well as Books Virgin Islands and 7. A crucial point of difference is that philosophers have knowledge while non-philosophers merely have belief, a distinction which is explored in some depth and detail. We devote special attention to one of the Republic's most crucial arguments, the powers argument, in which Socrates argues for the existence of the forms, the mind independently real, timeless essences of the many particular things that populate the everyday world of our senses. The reality of the forms is perhaps Plato's most distinctive metaphysical view, so we devote quite a bit of attention to stating, explaining, and evaluating the powers argument, and to discussing the implications of its being seriously flawed. Chapter 9, The Philosopher's Virtues, continues to explore the distinction between philosophers and non-philosophers, focusing on their different characters. Central to the discussion is the distinction between virtues of character, for example, justice, intellectual virtues, for example, a good memory, and virtues of personal style, for example, grace and elegance, attending to the light this last category sheds on Plato's moral vision. As a prelude to the key analogies of Book 6, the rest of this chapter is devoted to the interesting analogies Socrates appeals to in addressing features of the third wave. Chapter 10, Metaphors to Think By, the Sun and Divided Line Analogies, is devoted to the marquee analogies of Book 6, both of which address the third wave by developing the distinction between the sensible world of concrete particular things and the intelligible world of the forms. Having suggested that the form of the good is even more important than justice, Socrates cannot or will not say what the good is, but he does say what he thinks it is like. The good plays the same role in the intelligible world as the sun plays in the visible world. In the analogy of the divided line, Socrates further develops the distinction between belief, which is appropriate to the sensible, visible world, and knowledge, which is appropriate to the intelligible world of the forms. By exploring the role that hypotheses play in reasoning, he distinguishes philosophical knowledge from mathematical knowledge, somewhat surprisingly taking the former to be more rigorous. True to its name, Chapter 11, Shedding Light on the Allegory of the Cave, devotes itself to exploring the famous allegory of the cave from Book 7 of the Republic, carefully considering its various stages and themes before examining the issue posed by the enlightened philosopher's return to the cave. As Socrates describes it, the enlightened philosopher descends back into the cave not because they want to, but because they recognize that justice requires them to do so. This raises an issue for discussion that Socrates does not seem to notice. The enlightened philosopher would be happier if they ignored the demands of justice and remained in the intelligible world of the forms, which suggests that, contrary to Socrates' view, the just life is not happier than the unjust life. In Chapter 12, The Decline and Fall of the Ideal City Soul, we begin exploring Socrates' answer to the Republic's second question. In Books 8 and 9, Socrates sketches 5 kinds of cities and souls, noting what each takes as its primary end or goal and which part or class governs the soul and city, respectively. We trace the decay from the best city soul to the worst, attending to the role that changes to education play and to interesting features of each stage, and discuss at some length Plato's distinction between necessary and unnecessary desires. Chapter 13, The Republic's Second Question Answered, 3.5 Arguments that the Just Life is Happier, explores the argument Socrates gives in Book 9 that the just life is happier indeed, 729 times happier than the unjust life. There are fascinating features of the first 2 arguments, for example that the tyrannical person is incapable of friendship and that each part of the soul has a distinctive kind of pleasure. The third argument, the metaphysics of pleasure argument, argues that since what is more filling is more pleasant and what is more real is more filling, the forms, being the most real things, ground the most pleasant pleasures. We discuss this argument at some length, noting its dependence on the powers argument but also exploring ways in which Socrates seems to anticipate and preemptively respond to objections. In the last argument, which Socrates does not identify as such, hence the half, is a metaphorical argument which, despite its being less philosophically rigorous than the metaphysics of pleasure argument, is more intuitively persuasive and in no way relies on the problematic powers argument. This chapter concludes with a discussion of Plato's paternalism, his view that most of us, being incapable of the philosophical wisdom that consists of knowledge of the good, are incapable of good self-governance, so we are all better off being governed by someone else's, i.e., a philosopher king's or queen's, reason. Chapter 14, Are we there yet? Tying Up Loose Ends in Book 1 Foot explores the three topics of the Republic's final book, Book 10. The first is the status of poetry, which Socrates wants to revisit since he now has a psychology, the three-part soul, that he lacked when poetry was first discussed. He concludes, quite reluctantly, that very little poetry will be allowed in the ideal city, mainly because of its power to corrupt us. We give ourselves over to emotion and thus dethrone reason from its rightful place. After exploring his arguments for this view, we turn to his argument for the immortality of the soul, which Socrates offers in the context of showing the external advantages of living a just life, namely, having a reputation for justice, which were set aside to answer Glaucon's and Adiamantus' challenge of showing that justice was intrinsically good, that all by itself it made its possessor better off. Lastly, we attend to the myth of Air, with which the Republic ends. Air's story is an allegory about the importance of careful choice in living justly and thus happily. It is a fascinating way to end the Republic. In terms of both content and style, we briefly explore what philosophical points Plato might be making by ending a work of philosophy this way. Needless to say, I have not mentioned everything we will discuss, but this should give readers a good sense of the main contours of the Republic and a decent idea of what is to come. Now, on to the Republic. Chapter 1. Fathers and Sons. Plato packs a lot into the Republic's first book, so we will have an easier time of it if we break the discussion into 2 chapters. In this chapter, we will examine Socrates' conversations with Cephalus and then with Cephalus' son, Polemarchus. In the next chapter, we will explore Socrates' encounter with Thrasymachus. The ever-curious Socrates wants to know what justice is, not simply for its own sake, but to determine whether a just life, a morally good life, is happier than an unjust one. As mentioned in the introduction, the Greek word delta iota kappa alpha iota omicron sigma nu eta, dikaiosin, is broader in meaning than the English word justice, which often suggests fair distributions or the idea of rights. I will continue to use it, but I will often also use synonyms such as right and moral goodness and their ilk. Righteousness seems a bit archaic and can have religious connotations that can be misleading. It is often thought that Book 1 of the Republic was initially a standalone dialogue as it ends, like so many of Plato's other dialogues do, without an answer to its central question. Most of these dialogues have Socrates asking, what is, where an important notion like justice, knowledge, or courage fills in the blank. Socrates examines the answers his companions propose, but typically finds them wanting, usually because they conflict with other beliefs held by the interlocutor. While not knowing what something is can be frustrating, knowing what it is not is often a helpful kind of knowledge, as it narrows the field and leaves us a bit closer to knowing what the thing here, justice, is. Though Book 1 ends without a satisfactory answer to its central question, rather than the discussants going their separate ways, as usually happens in Plato's dialogues, 2 of the participants, Glaucon and Adiamantus, Plato's real-life brothers, insist that Socrates continues, that he shares his beliefs about the nature and value of justice, even if he cannot in good conscience claim to know its nature and value. Polemarchus wants you to wait. Dialogues, which are extraordinarily well crafted. That Plato writes dialogues rather than straightforward essays suggests that he regards philosophy as essentially conversational, that it involves back and forth, give and take, that 2 or 3 heads are better than one when addressing philosophical topics like the nature of justice. The dialogue form also invites us to be active rather than passive readers, to engage in the dialogue by thinking of responses and questions that the people on the page do not make. In addition to Plato's making a philosophical point by writing in dialogue form, his writing this way allows him to raise themes and issues that are at work in the background, where the conversation he is depicting is in the foreground. The opening lines of the Republic are an excellent example of this. The Republic is Socrates' first-person account of a long conversation about the nature and value of justice that he has at the house of Cephalus, a wealthy merchant who lives in the Piraeus, the port of Athens. Plato's situating the conversation outside of Athens might be his way of suggesting that the ideal city Socrates and his friends will imaginatively construct is an alternative to Athens. He is not offering suggestions for ways in which Athens might change for the better, but instead offers a different political arrangement entirely. It is worth noting that the Republic is written around 380 BC, in the shadow of Athens' defeat in the Peloponnesian War about 20 years previously. The conversation depicted takes place well before that, though scholars disagree about the dialogue's dramatic date. One likely candidate is 421 BC, during the optimistic springtime peace of Nicias, the truce marking the end of the first phase of the war. Another is 411 BC, after the war has resumed and is going quite badly for Athens, a gloomy, violence-torn, pessimistic time. Point 1 Plato's contemporaries would know, and many contemporary readers will know, that Socrates was tried, convicted, and executed in 399 BC for corrupting the youth and introducing false gods. Few contemporary readers, by contrast, will know that Polemarchus, who features prominently in Book 1, was executed by the so-called 30 tyrants, who, installed by Sparta at the war's end, ruled briefly and bloodily in 404 BC. Socrates' reason for venturing out of Athens to attend a religious festival and offer up my prayers to the goddess is a good example of Plato's subtle authorial artistry. As we noted above, the historical Socrates was tried, convicted, and put to death by the citizens of Athens for impiety and corrupting the youth. Plato memorably recounts Socrates' defense speech in the Apology, a title that will seem odd, given how unapologetic Socrates is in it, until we realize that apologia is Greek for defense. So Plato's depiction of Socrates' conventional piety at the very outset of the Republic provides an ironic take on then recent Athenian history that would not be lost on any of Plato's contemporaries. Socrates' opening words, "I went down," which translate the Greek kap alpha tau beta nu, kataben, seem an unremarkable way to begin a remarkable book. But we will appreciate their significance and Plato's subtle authorial artistry later in the Republic, when, in the famous allegory of the cave, Socrates insists that the enlightened philosophers go down again into the cave to govern its benighted prisoners and free those who are capable of making it out. It is the same verb in both cases, and in subtly drawing this parallel, Plato seems to be telling us that Socrates' interlocutors, and by extension, us, his readers, whatever our accomplishments and pretension, do indeed live in the darkness of the cave. "It's a strange image you are describing," says Glaucon, "and strange prisoners." "They are like us," Socrates replies. Socrates tells his unnamed audience that Polemarchus' slave tugged on his cloak and asked him to wait. The casual invocation of slavery may bring many contemporary readers up short. Slavery was a fact of life in the Greek world, and lovers of Plato and other great classical authors such as Aeschylus, Aristophanes, and Aristotle, to name just three near the beginning of the alphabet, should at the very least pause at the possibility that the cultural achievement of classical Athens was possible only because it was a slave society. Although the claim is not uncontroversial, the consensus of contemporary scholars is that there is slavery in Plato's ideal polis. We may have occasion to investigate this later, but for now we might just note the fact that Polemarchus' slave is the first person Socrates quotes in the Republic. Although Athenian slavery might partially frame the Republic for modern readers, Plato does not seem to raise it as a background issue worthy of philosophical attention, and there is no explicit discussion of its nature or moral status. Plato seems to accept it as something natural. Later, he suggests that an individual might be by nature suited to be a slave, an idea Aristotle develops in the first book of his Politics, but subject to moral constraint. For example, we are told that Greeks should not enslave other Greeks, and that rather than being harsh with his slaves, a good and properly educated person will merely look down on them. When Polemarchus finally catches up to Socrates, he tells him, "You must either prove stronger than we are, or you will have to stay here." This sounds ominous, but it is just an innocent pun on Socrates' name, the central element of which is kaparotau omicron, kratos, meaning strength or power. One suspects this is not the first time Socrates has endured this rather lame pun, but he replies graciously and without groaning, asking if there is not another alternative, that we persuade you to let us go. This little exchange is Plato's way of raising an important theme of the Republic, the opposition between force and persuasion, between the irrational and the rational. The conflict sometimes comes to the surface, for example, in the cave allegory mentioned above. Education, as Plato conceives of it, involves quite a bit of force. The freed prisoner is compelled to stand up, turn his head, and look up toward the light, and is dragged, from there by force, up the rough, steep path, and then dragged, into the sunlight. Though the enlightened philosophers would rather remain above, they return to the cave not because they are physically or psychologically compelled to do so, but because they are persuaded to. In response to Socrates' appeal to persuasion, Polemarchus jokingly plays a trump card, but could you persuade us, if we won't listen? Here Plato is recognizing a practical limit to the power of most of us have probably encountered people who seem impervious to evidence and argument. More chillingly, the psychologists Brendan Nyhan and Jason Reifler have identified what they call the backfire effect. Some of us are psychologically constituted so as to not merely remain unpersuaded by evidence and reasons that should lead us to give up certain beliefs, but actually tend to hold such beliefs even more strongly in the face of such evidence, so attempts to persuade the other by appeals to good evidence are likely to backfire. Plato is reminding us that genuine discussion and dialogue, as opposed to dueling monologues, cannot occur when we refuse to entertain reasons and evidence that go against our views. He is raising an important theme that will be at work in the background of the Republic, and raising it in the subtle way skilled literary artists do. There is more we could say about the subtleties of the Republic's opening, however the goal was not an exhaustive and exhausting catalogue and discussion of them, but rather to help the reader begin to appreciate the literary quality of the Republic and how inseparable its literary and philosophical aspects are for Plato. Cephalus. Justice is paying your debts and telling the truth. The entire conversation that is the Republic takes place at the suburban home of Cephalus, a wealthy merchant, whose son, Polemarchus, has a keen interest in philosophy. Cephalus likes Socrates, and Socrates clearly likes him. Nowadays, telling someone that you enjoy talking to them because you enjoy talking with the very old is unlikely to be well received, but Cephalus does not mind, in part because of the association of age and wisdom. Since Cephalus is farther along the road of life, he might have some insight about whether that road is rough and difficult or smooth and easy. The metaphor of the road or path is one we will see elsewhere in the Republic. Cephalus is a fine spokesperson for moral common sense. His idea of a good life is not a life of sex, drinking parties, and feasts, but rather one of moderation. Being wealthy does not hurt, he admits, but all by itself material comfort is not sufficient for living well. A good person would not easily bear old age if he were poor, he remarks, but a bad one would not be at peace with himself, even if he were wealthy. Despite his conventional decency, Cephalus is not especially reflective, and when the discussion turns philosophical, he congenially excuses himself to take care of a religious sacrifice. Cephalus exhibits an attractive kind of humility, as he is sufficiently self-aware to recognize that external factors play an important role in his being morally decent, and thus that he himself is not the sole cause of his goodness. Plato is deftly setting up a contrast between character and circumstance, between the inner and the outer, that will come into play later in the Republic as he addresses the question of whether one can cultivate one's soul in such a way that one is more or less impervious to external forces that can lead one to act unjustly. Before Cephalus leaves, Socrates pursues this question of wealth a bit further, asking Cephalus what the greatest good that his wealth has brought him is. Cephalus' answer is a bit surprising, and is no doubt part of why Socrates likes him. It is not that it enables a life of self-indulgence, cushy comfort, and lots of toys. Rather, it is that wealth is a kind of buffer against moral temptation. Wealth can do a lot to save us from having to cheat and deceive, Cephalus says, and thus it allows a person to face the afterlife without trepidation, since it enables one to live a just and pious life. Most of us will agree that wealth is merely instrumentally and not intrinsically valuable, that it is not good in itself, but rather it is good as a means to something else. Cephalus is making a related but subtly different point about the sort of value wealth possesses, that wealth is conditionally good. Its goodness depends not just upon the use to which it is put, but on who is doing the putting on, whose wealth it is. If my wealth enables my pursuing pleasures that are ultimately self-destructive, then my being wealthy is bad for me. A decent and orderly person will benefit from their wealth, since they will use it well. This distinction between conditional and unconditional value provides a nice segue to a distinctively philosophical turn in the conversation. Though Cephalus has not himself offered a definition of justice, Socrates hears one lurking beneath the surface and asks, but speaking of this very thing itself, namely, justice, are we to say unconditionally that it is speaking the truth and paying whatever debts one has incurred? Or is doing these things sometimes just, sometimes unjust? It is important to understand that Socrates is not looking for a verbal definition of justice here, the sort of thing that one can look up in a dictionary or use to explain its meaning to someone learning one's language. He is looking for the real definition of justice, for an account of the thing itself. Here real does not contrast with fake or imaginary but with verbal. Etymologically real derives from the Latin word res, which means thing or matter. There is no question about the verbal definition of dikaioson, the word we are translating justice. It means morally right conduct generally. But exactly what morally right conduct is what Socrates wants to know. Trying to get clear about everyday concepts like justice, courage, knowledge, etc., by making explicit what is usually left implicit is one of philosophy's main tasks, for Plato. Plato's dialogues typically consist of Socrates encountering someone who claims to know the real definition of a virtue like justice or courage or temperance. But after some Socratic question and answer, it becomes clear that the proposed definition will not work, usually because it is inconsistent with other things his interlocutor believes, and that is what happens here. Most of the dialogues end without a definition being arrived at. They end in what scholars call pi omicron rho alpha, aporia, difficulty, perplexity. On Cephalus' definition of justice, more accurately, the definition Socrates attributes to him, justice is telling the truth and paying one's debts. It is instructive to note what Socrates does not do here. He does not shrug and offer a relativistic platitude such as, well, everyone's got a right to their opinion. Socrates does not think that questions like the one he is asking are mere matters of taste, and there would be little point in discussing them if they were. If you think broccoli is delicious and I cannot stand it, an argument about who is right is pointless, since there is no fact of the matter about whether broccoli is delicious. Hence the maxim de gustibus non est disputandum, there is no disputing about matters of taste. If, by contrast, we disagree about the cube root of 729, at least one of us is wrong. Philosophical questions about the nature of justice and knowledge, courage, temperance, love, etc., will seem to many thoughtful people to fall somewhere in between these extremes, not mere matters of taste, but not as certain as truths of mathematics. Socrates thinks that there is a correct answer to his question about the nature of justice, and about knowledge, courage, temperance, etc., so in one sense of the term, he is a realist. He thinks there really is a fact of the matter of what justice is, a way things are that is independent of what we might think, which is the very thing the relativist denies. When Hamlet, by contrast, says that there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so, he is expressing an anti-realist view about the nature of goodness. Things are not mind-independently good or bad, their being good or bad is determined by our attitudes toward them. Realism is not an all-or-nothing affair. One can be a realist about morality, thinking that there really are moral facts such as murder is wrong and kindness is good, but an anti-realist about aesthetics, thinking that beauty really is just in the eye of the beholder. While many readers will be leery about Socrates' moral realism, an attractive feature of his method of rigorous cross-examination is that it does not depend on his realism, for it aims to discover whether someone's view is consistent with other things they believe. So the elenchus aims to lead the cross-examined party not to the unvarnished moral truth, but rather to intellectual self-awareness and, hopefully, to intellectual humility if, as is often the case, one recognizes that one's beliefs do not hang together consistently. Having noted what Socrates does not do in his conversation with Cephalus, let us look at what he does do. He argues that if Cephalus' definition of justice is correct, then it would be just to return a borrowed weapon when its now deranged owner asks for it back. But Cephalus himself does not think this. Since his definition implies something that he thinks is false, Cephalus should think that his definition is false. This form of argument is as common in everyday life as it is in philosophy. If A implies B and B is false, A must be false too. Any argument that fits this pattern is valid. If its premises are true, then its conclusion must be true. If it is true that the sidewalk gets wet if it rains, and it is true that the sidewalk is not getting wet, then it must also be true that it is not raining, for if it were raining, the sidewalk would be getting wet, and it is not, thus, it cannot be raining. If my aggrieved friend says, if A, you were a good friend, then B, you would have helped me move, I know how the rest of the argument goes even if they do not spell it out, not B, you did not help me move, therefore, not A, you are not a good friend. I might reply by hanging my head in shame and conceding that I am not a good friend. That is, I take the argument to be not only logically valid, in other words, its conclusion must be true if its premises are true, but sound as well. It is valid and its premises are in fact true. But I might also reply by insisting that while the argument is logically valid, it is not sound, since its first premise is false. While it is generally true that a good friend will help one move, it is not true without exception. If I was in the hospital donating a kidney to another friend and was unable to help you move, my not helping does not imply that I am not a good friend. A more plausible version of the first premise would be if A. You were a good friend and C. Were able to help me move, then B. You would have done so. On this more nuanced version of the argument, the conclusion to draw from the fact that I did not help is that either not A. I am not a good friend or not C. I was not able to help. I do not want us to get too bogged down in detail, but attention to the logic of the arguments offered is crucial to doing philosophy in general and to understanding the Republic in particular, especially Book 1. Now, just as I had some options in responding to my friend's argument, so too does Cephalus have options in responding to Socrates. Perhaps he should concede that his definition is false. But he could also change his mind about whether it would be wrong to return the weapon. This seems less plausible. Most of us are surer of particular moral judgments we make than we are about more general moral principles. But if Cephalus is very confident in the truth of his definition, we might be willing to bite the bullet, as philosophers say, and accept an initially unpalatable claim. Another option would be to argue that the definition does not actually imply the problematic judgment, much as I did with my friend in the example above. Or he can challenge Socrates' unstated assumption that the definition of justice must be unconditional, never allowing any exceptions. Note that this is not a challenge to Socrates' definitional realism. Cephalus can still think that there is a uniquely correct definition while at the same time thinking that the correct definition is the sort of thing that holds only for the most part. In his imposingly titled Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, the great modern philosopher Immanuel Kant insisted that moral principles must hold universally and not merely generally. 3. While Plato's student Aristotle, by contrast, thought that moral truths hold only for the most part, and that we must not demand more rigor than a subject affords. Plato is closer to Kant on this score than he is to Aristotle. We will not settle this dispute here, or anywhere in this book. I raise it not only to show that Cephalus has philosophical options he does not seem to be aware of, but also to show that an important task of philosophy is making the implicit explicit. Socrates assumes that real definitions must hold without exception. While he may be correct about this, he may not be. Moral definitions and principles might lack the universality and precision we expect of their mathematical cousins. A related assumption Socrates makes is that there really is one feature that all just things have in common, something in virtue of which they are all just. In other words, there must be an essence of justice and similarly an essence of courage, wisdom, tree, table, etc. Plato has a surprising view about the nature of these essences, which he calls the forms. He not only thinks that the forms are mind-independently real, he thinks that they are more real than the particular things that are instances of them. We will get to that in Chapter 8, when we will also query the assumption that there is in essence a real definition of justice and that the task of philosophy is to figure out what that essence is. Polemarchus. Justice is benefiting friends and harming enemies. Socrates thinks that the proposed definition of justice has been decisively refuted, but Polemarchus, Cephalus' son, disagrees, and for support he appeals to the poet Simonides. This appeal to poetic authority raises an important theme that will be explored later in the Republic. Do poets, especially great poets such as Homer, have knowledge of things such as the nature of justice? Does the fact that Homer or Pindar or Simonides says something give us a good reason to think that it is true? Anyone who has spent much time on Facebook and who has a philosophical bent has probably asked similar questions. Does the fact that George Clooney, for example, thinks drastic action needs to be taken to deal with climate change give me good reason to think so, too? It seems not, but many of us find the deliverances of celebrities persuasive nonetheless. Socrates plainly loves Homer. He quotes him and other poets throughout the Republic. He will reluctantly conclude in Book 10 that poets and artists generally do not possess the moral authority that the Polemarchuses of the world attribute to them. But for now, he sets this issue aside and queries the definition of justice Polemarchus appeals to. Polemarchus first suggests that justice is giving to each what they are owed. While his father's definition was too specific, Polemarchus is perhaps too general. What exactly are people owed? Polemarchus answers that we owe good to our friends and bad to our enemies. This is not an outlandish view, indeed, it is common sense to Polemarchus and his contemporaries. The countervailing Christian idea that we should love our enemies would find few adherents in classical Athens. Socrates makes two arguments against Polemarchus' definition of justice as benefiting one's friends and harming one's enemies, but before looking at them, we should attend to a problematic feature of his definition. It divides the moral world into friends and enemies, but surely that does not exhaust the possibilities. It is likely that most of the people one encounters on any given day do not fall into either category. And though I am lucky enough to have some people I consider genuine friends, my life is not interesting enough for me to have any enemies, alas. A central moral question most thoughtful people ask is what, if any, moral duties they have toward strangers, especially strangers halfway around the world, who do not fit into either camp. Polemarchus' definition of justice gives us no help in answering that question. As with his argument against Cephalus, Socrates' argument against Polemarchus' account of justice is an indirect argument, aiming to show that the definition implies things that Polemarchus himself thinks are false. Socrates argues that Polemarchus' account of justice implies that justice is not especially valuable and, moreover, that it is a craft of stealing. Since Polemarchus does not think either of those implications is true, Socrates argues, his definition must be false. The pattern is the same one we saw above: A implies B, B is not true, so A must not be true. Here, B has two parts. The subclaims that justice is not valuable and that justice is a craft of stealing, so the argument is a slightly more complex variation on the argument Socrates made against Polemarchus, but they exhibit essentially the same pattern. P1. If Polemarchus' definition of justice is correct, then justice is not valuable and it is a craft of stealing. P2. But it is false that justice is not valuable and that it is a craft of stealing. See, therefore, Polemarchus' definition of justice is not correct. As with the argument above, this one is valid. If its premises are true, its conclusion that Polemarchus' definition is mistaken must be true. Since the argument is valid, the only way to avoid the truth of the conclusion is to find at least one of the premises to be false. Polemarchus feels himself in a bind because he thinks that his definition is true, and thus that the conclusion of Socrates' argument is false, and also that both premises seem true. He does not seem to know how to respond. I do not know any more what I did mean, but I still believe that to benefit friends and harm one's enemies is justice. Polemarchus' plight is not uncommon among Plato's characters. They recognize that Socrates has them intellectually cornered, but they do not seem to know what to do. Adeimantus describes the experience of many of Socrates' interlocutors a bit later in the Republic, just as inexperienced checkers players are trapped by the experts in the end and cannot make a move, so, your interlocutors, too, are trapped in the end and have nothing to say in this different kind of checkers, which is played not with discs, but with words. I think that Plato puts Polemarchus in this predicament because he wants us, his readers, to engage philosophically in the discussion by doing for ourselves what Polemarchus is not able to do, to carefully scrutinize Socrates' reasoning and to think through his assumptions. Perhaps we can help Polemarchus out. Since Socrates' argument is valid, the main issue is whether it is sound. Why should we think that its first premise is true? Is justice a craft? Socrates' argument that P1 is true, and notice that he offers an argument for a premise that itself is part of a larger argument, turns on the idea of a craft taukainoeda, techni, in Greek, from which words like technique and technology derive. A doctor is a person skilled in the craft of medicine. They know how to use their skill to benefit their friends by healing them and harm their enemies by poisoning them. Similarly, the person skilled in the craft of cooking can use that skill to benefit their friends and harm their enemies via the food they cook. Readers who have seen the film The Help might think of Minnie's special chocolate pie as an example. The crucial move takes place when Socrates says, "Now, what does the craft we call justice give, and to whom or what does it give it?" If justice is a craft in the same way that medicine, cooking, navigation, and the like are crafts, then like them it will have its own special sphere in which it operates to benefit friends and harm enemies. Medicine's sphere or domain is health. It is there that its skilled practitioner can benefit friends and harm enemies. Medicine is not useful outside its sphere. For example, the person skilled in navigation can benefit friends and harm enemies at sea, not the person skilled in medicine. This is not to say that these spheres do not overlap. There is a sense in which a doctor can benefit and harm passengers on a ship, but their being at sea is irrelevant to the doctor benefiting and harming them. Polemarchus does not challenge the assumption that justice is a craft. Indeed, he agrees that partnerships are the sphere of the craft of justice. But, Socrates argues, when choosing a partner for checkers, we want a skillful checkers player, not someone skilled in the craft of justice. The same can be said for other crafts such as house building and horse breeding. When we form a partnership to build a house or buy a horse, we want someone skilled in those crafts, and being just does not make anyone a better builder or breeder. It is when we are not using something and want to safeguard it, Socrates argues, that we choose the person skilled in justice, who will not steal our money or our horse or our prized violin. So, Socrates concludes, justice is not worth very much, since it is only useful for useless things. This conclusion is an embarrassing one for Polemarchus' view, but it is not fatal to it. The fatal blow comes next. The person most skilled at protecting a computer network, to use an anachronistic example, is the person most skilled at hacking into networks. Since they know where the weak spots are, they will know how to patch them. At the end of the film Catch Me If You Can, master forger Franca Bagnall goes to work for the FBI, teaching agents how to spot forgeries. Socrates' general point is this: whenever someone is a clever guardian, then he is also a clever thief. But since the person skilled in the craft of justice is the best guardian of an item, they will also be best able to steal it and presumably avoid detection. Thus the just person is a kind of thief, and justice, by being a craft of guarding what is valuable, turns out to be a craft of stealing. Polemarchus is flummoxed. He does not think that justice is useless or a craft of stealing, but he has been led to the view that justice is useless and a craft of stealing by a series of steps that he agreed to. I think that Polemarchus should, but does not, question the assumption driving the argument that justice is a craft. Certainly, character virtues like justice are similar to crafts in interesting and important ways. For example, both are practical, involving know-how. Both are acquired by practice, by doing. Both are desirable to possess and objects of praise. But or at least a, crucial difference between them is that crafts are morally neutral, while character virtues moral virtues are not. As Socrates points out, the doctor, who possesses the craft of medicine, can use their craft for good or ill, to benefit and harm. If Polemarchus' definition of justice is correct, the doctor uses their craft to benefit their friends and harm their enemies and thereby exhibits justice. But a doctor who uses the craft of medicine to harm their friends is acting unjustly, on Polemarchus' view. Whether the doctor acts justly depends upon how they use their craft. Crafts are good, but they are conditionally good, good only if used appropriately. Their moral goodness is not intrinsic. Virtues, by contrast, seem to be unconditionally, intrinsically good. Possessing them makes their possessor morally better off, even if it makes them, say, financially worse off. Courage might seem to pose a problem for this claim, but we can set that worry aside for now. When Socrates asks, is someone a good and useful partner in a game of checkers because he is just or because he is a checkers player, he is treating the craft and the virtue as the same kind of thing. Instead of agreeing, Polemarchus should say, that is a false dilemma, Socrates. You are assuming that someone cannot be both just and a good checkers player because you are assuming that justice is a craft, and it is not. I want to play against someone who is good at checkers. The challenge makes the game more fun and someone who is not going to cheat. Being just does not make anyone a better builder or breeder or checkers player, but it does make someone a better partner to engage in those crafts with, since it makes her less likely to take unfair advantage or cheat. Perhaps Polemarchus has some implicit grasp of this point, which may be one reason why he remains unconvinced by Socrates' argument against his definition. It turns out that the first premise of Socrates' argument against Polemarchus' definition is more complex than it initially seemed. It is not. P1. If a Polemarchus' definition of justice is correct, then c. justice is not valuable and d. justice is a craft of stealing. But rather, P1 star. If A. Polemarchus' definition of justice is correct and B. Justice is a craft, then C. Justice is not valuable and D. Justice is a craft of stealing. With the structure of P1 thus clarified, Polemarchus has a good response to Socrates. His conceding that C and D are both false no longer entails that A is false, i.e., that his definition of justice is not correct. Instead, the falsity of C and D entail that either A is false or B is false, and maybe both. And we have independent reasons for thinking B is false. Character virtues such as justice are like crafts in many ways, but they are not crafts, since crafts are morally neutral while character virtues and vices are morally loaded. Speaking of friends. The next argument has the same structure as the first. The definition implies something that is false, so it must be false, or at least Polemarchus ought to think it is false. In fact, Socrates seems to show that Polemarchus' definition implies that it is just to harm people who have done us no injustice, i.e., who are not our enemies. Then, according to your account, it is just to do bad things to those who do no injustice. Here the culprit is Polemarchus' mistaken account of who a friend is. Socrates distinguishes between subjective and objective accounts of friendship. On a subjective view, you are my friend if I think you are good and useful. What matters are my beliefs about you. On the objective view, you are my friend if in fact you are good and useful, regardless of whether I think so. Polemarchus opts for the first, subjective option, but Socrates points out that we are often mistaken about this sort of thing, which can lead to harming our friends and benefiting our enemies. Notice that here Polemarchus recognizes that his view is defective, since it implies something he knows to be false. My account, lambda gamma omicron, logos, must be a bad one, he says, proposing that they modify the subjective account of friendship, opting for a hybrid account that combines the objective and subjective accounts, someone who is both believed to be useful and as useful as a friend, someone who is believed to be useful but is not, is believed to be a friend but is not. This exchange shows Polemarchus in a better light than the first. He is much more active than in the first argument, where for the most part he limited himself to one-word replies to Socrates' somewhat leading questions. At the conclusion of the first argument he seemed helplessly befuddled, vaguely recognizing that there was some problem with his view but sticking to it nonetheless. I do not know any more what I did mean, but I still believe that to benefit one's friends and harm one's enemies is justice. In this exchange, he not only clearly recognizes the problem, his subjective account of friendship, but articulates the solution: let us change our definition of friendship. He is more rationally engaged in this exchange and provides a pretty good model for thinking philosophically, which, in the end, really just comes down to thinking clearly. It may be that his rational vision is sharper in this exchange, however I suspect it is not that his vision has improved, but rather that the problem is more visible in this exchange than in the first. But does the just person harm anyone? Where Socrates' first criticisms of Polemarchus' definition are indirect, aiming to show that it implies things that Polemarchus himself rejects, the last criticism is more direct, challenging the definition itself and, indeed, is a direct challenge to an element of Greek common-sense morality that would seem to most Athenians to be unassailable. The proposed definition cannot be right, Socrates argues, because it is never just to harm anyone. It is an argument that is important both to the scheme of Book 1 of the Republic and to moral philosophy generally. One of the argument's key elements is the concept of a virtue, which we employed without exploring whether a virtue such as justice is a craft. While we are perhaps likelier to think of virtue in the singular, referring to someone's character in general, or, anachronistically, to sexual chastity, it is usually plural in the Republic. Indeed, in Book 4 we will find Socrates giving accounts of the four cardinal virtues: justice, moderation, courage, and wisdom. The Greek word is rho epsilon tau, arete, which does not have the necessarily moral connotation that the English word virtue possesses. The word virtuoso retains this non-moral sense. It is still an evaluative term, but not a morally evaluative one. The word good often functions this way. When you call someone a good person, you are morally evaluating and praising them. When you call them a good dancer or a good mechanic or a good thief, you are evaluating them, but you are not evaluating them morally, you are saying that they are good at a particular craft or activity. Some translators try to remind their readers of this non-moral aspect by opting for excellence instead of virtue in translating arete. This makes sense, since if things like dogs and knives have virtues which they do, as Plato understands the concept, it must have a non-moral dimension. But our translator opts for virtue, so to avoid confusion we will follow his lead. The concept of a virtue is best understood in terms of the concept of a function. A thing's function is the work it does, its goal-directed purpose. The Greek word for function is rho-gamma-omicron-nu, ergon, which is the root of the English word ergonomic. Some readers have ergonomic computer keyboards that are wedge-shaped or chairs that are ergonomically designed, which means that they are designed to enable their users to work more efficiently as they carry out the object's function. More technically, the function is the goal-directed activity characteristic of the kind of thing in question. Artifacts like knives and cars have functions, but so too do natural objects. The function of a knife is to cut, the function of a heart is to pump blood. In one sense, a thing's function is what makes it what it is. Understood in terms of function, a plastic knife and a metal knife have more in common with each other than a plastic knife and a plastic fork do. Understood materially rather than functionally, that is, understood in terms of the matter they are composed of rather than their tasks, the plastic knife and plastic fork are more similar to each other than either is to the metal knife. A hallmark of modern science since Galileo and Newton is jettisoning functional or teleological, that is, goal-directed, explanations of natural phenomena in favor of material and mechanistic explanations. Rain does not have a purpose in the modern worldview. That rain waters crops and thus enables life is a welcome side effect of rain. A scientific account of why it rained this morning will appeal to various meteorological facts, not to the function or purpose of rain. But these functional or teleological explanations, while out of place in physics and chemistry, still find a home in biology and psychology, for example, and in ordinary life. When in the silence of the lambs Clarice seeks Hannibal's help in catching Buffalo Bill, he encourages her to think teleologically. What does he do, this man you seek? When she answers, he kills women, Hannibal replies in his eerie, sing-song voice, no. That is incidental. He is telling her that until she understands the goal around which he organizes his murderous activity, i.e., until she understands Bill's function, she will not be able to understand him, much less to catch him. 6. A virtue, then, is the state that enables the thing to perform its function well, and a vice, by contrast, is the state that prevents the thing from performing its function well. Sharpness is the virtue of a knife, since sharpness is what enables the knife to cut well, and dullness is a knife's vice, since it prevents the knife from cutting well. A dull knife still might cut, but it will not cut well. So a virtue is a good-making feature of thing. Sharpness makes for a good knife, since a sharp knife cuts well. If it sounds odd to talk of a knife's virtue, keep in mind that excellence is another way to translate arate. The virtue of a heart is a bit more complicated, which makes sense, given how complicated hearts are, but the basic idea is the same. The heart's virtue is the condition that enables it to pump blood well. Now that we have explored the concept of a virtue, let us see how Socrates puts it to work in his third, direct argument against Polemarchus' definition of justice. Since possessing the relevant virtue makes something good, you make something worse by depriving it of its virtue. Thus, making a knife duller makes it worse. Now, of course, there may be times when a dull knife is preferable to a sharp one. One does not use a sharp knife as a prop in a movie or play, because it is too dangerous. But notice how the knife's function has quietly changed. As a prop, its function is not to cut but to appear to do so. You do not give scalpel-sharp scissors to a kindergartner but instead scissors that do not cut as well, since we will sacrifice cutting capacity in favor of safety. The upshot of all this is that to harm something is to make it worse off with respect to the relevant virtue. The key move in the argument occurs when Polemarchus agrees with Socrates' suggestion that justice is the human virtue. There is no mention of the human function here, something that Plato's student Aristotle will make the centerpiece of his ethics, but we can reason backwards to it, if we are so inclined. Perhaps our function is, at least in part, to live peacefully in communities. If so, then justice will be the trait, or surely among the traits, that will enable us to do so. When speaking of making objects worse, we tend to reserve harm for animate objects and employ damage for inanimate ones. It sounds odd to say that I harmed the lawnmower by not putting oil in the engine. But harm and damage are both ways to make something worse, and in both cases I make the thing worse by depriving it of the relevant virtue. So, just as I would damage the knife by depriving it of its characteristic virtue, sharpness, I would harm a person by depriving them of the characteristic human virtue, justice. People who are harmed must become more unjust. But, Socrates asks, how could a just person, acting justly, make someone else less just? A musician cannot by exhibiting musical excellence make others less musical, he thinks, any more than an excellent parent or teacher can make someone else a worse parent or teacher through the very exercise of their excellence. The very idea is incoherent, Socrates thinks. Thus the proposed definition is intrinsically, rather than extrinsically, flawed. The problem is not that the definition has false or undesirable implications, the problem is that its core idea, that justice involves harming those who deserve it, makes no sense. This conclusion has fascinating implications for theories of punishment, though this is not something that Socrates pursues here. If Socrates is correct, then retributivist accounts of punishment are deeply morally mistaken. Only punishment aiming at the wrongdoer's moral improvement would be justified. Retributive punishments, which seek to inflict harm because the wrongdoer deserves to suffer, would not be justifiable. Here it is important to remember that not all pain is harmful. We often inflict pain on ourselves and others for our and their own good, and it is especially heartrending when that other is a small child or companion animal with whom we cannot communicate our reasons for inflicting pain. We will see in the next chapter that Thrasymachus, who bursts on the scene at this argument's conclusion, has a lot to say in opposition to this argument's key premise, that justice is the human virtue, so we will not explore the argument in great detail here. One might wonder, though, about Socrates' point that a person or thing possessing virtue V cannot, by exercising V, make other things un-V or less V. Sharp knives become dull by their repeated use. After all, though the great Taoist Chuangzi, aka Chuangzi, might attribute this to a lack of excellence in the person wielding the knife, since Kukding's knife finds the empty spaces between the joints and thus is still as sharp as if it had just come off the whetstone, even after 19 years. 7. But let us set this aside and attend to how differently Polemarchus reacts to this Socratic refutation. After the first argument, he still stuck to his definition, insisting that justice was benefiting friends and harming enemies, even though he sensed something was amiss. Here, by contrast, he is completely convinced that his definition is mistaken, and profoundly so. Moreover, he agrees to be Socrates' partner in battle against those who advocate it. It is worth noting, as we wind down this chapter, how Socrates seeks to preserve the moral authority of the poet Simonides, to whose definition Polemarchus appealed when entering the conversation. When Polemarchus first jumps into the argument, Socrates describes Simonides as a wise and godlike men, though perhaps a bit ironically. A few pages later, having, he thinks, decisively refuted the definition, he suggests that the definition could not be Simonides after all, since no wise and godlike person could be so mistaken about the nature of justice. Instead, it must be the definition of a wealthy and powerful person seeking to cloak their bad conduct in the mantle of justice. This is yet another of the subtle ways in which Plato works important themes into the argument. As noted above, whether poets have the moral authority customarily ascribed to them will be explored later in the Republic. We have covered a lot of ground in this chapter. Hopefully readers have a good grasp of some of the key concepts that will be explored in the remainder of the Republic, and especially of the give and take that characterizes philosophical conversation. Chapter 2. Taming the Beast. The last half of Book 1 depicts Socrates' encounter with Thrasymachus. Like most characters in the Republic, Thrasymachus is a real person, and the views Plato attributes to him square with what is known of the historical Thrasymachus. Thrasymachus is a sophist, a professional, itinerant teacher of rhetoric, or the art of persuasion. Plato's worry about sophists is that their teaching is neither grounded in nor aimed at the truth, its only concern is persuasion. Enter Thrasymachus. Justice is whatever benefits the powerful. Thrasymachus bursts into the conversation like a wild beast, and Socrates twice remarks how frightening it was. His entrance might be merely an overly aggressive case of calling bullshit were it not for the antipathy he clearly has for Socrates. Socrates asks questions but never answers them. Thrasymachus complains and not. Thrasymachus thinks, because of any Socratic wisdom of knowing that he does not know the answers, but because of his love of honor. Thrasymachus thinks that Socrates just wants to win arguments. He responds to Socrates' assertions of the value of justice as a thing more valuable than even a large quantity of gold and of intellectual humility. We are incapable of finding it, with a loud, sarcastic laugh, dismissing them as just Socrates' usual irony. This last charge might sound strange to modern ears. Irony is often prized for its elegance. But here, irony, epsilon rho omega nu epsilon alpha, ironia, is seen as false modesty and thus a vice. In his Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle rates irony, which he calls mock modesty, as one of the vices flanking the virtue of truthfulness, roughly, being a straight shooter, the other being boastfulness, and in his Rhetoric he notes that people often respond to irony with anger, since it can seem to show contempt. Perhaps that is what earns Thrasymachus' ire. In any case, Thrasymachus has an answer to Socrates' question about the nature of justice, one he is very proud of. Justice is nothing other than the advantage of the stronger. Two things to notice straight away about Thrasymachus' account are its political nature and its reductive, deflationary tone. By the stronger he means the politically powerful, who make laws to benefit themselves. Good people follow those rules, thinking it just to do so, which benefits the rulemakers. The definition's deflationary, reductive aspect is brought out in the nothing other than locution. Claims that love is nothing but a biochemical phenomenon or a fairy tale or a social construction are meant to deflate the kinds of lofty claims one encounters at wedding receptions and on Valentine's Day cards. Thrasymachus offers his definition of justice in a similar vein. Though Socrates and Thrasymachus agree that justice is beneficial, they disagree about whom it benefits. Socrates thinks that justice, like any character virtue, benefits its possessor. My being just makes my life better. Thrasymachus, who will soon deny that justice is a virtue at all, claims that my being just benefits someone else, namely, the politically powerful rulemakers, who benefit from my following the rules which they have crafted for their own benefit. A just person, Thrasymachus argues, always gets less than an unjust one. They do not cheat their business partners or customers, they do not cheat on their taxes, and when they govern they make laws that benefit others rather than themselves. We will see soon enough that Socrates rejects Thrasymachus' picture of what a happy or flourishing human life looks like. Thrasymachus is a materialist not in the philosophical sense of thinking that there are no immaterial objects, but in the everyday sense of thinking that material success is the main goal of life and measure of success. Thrasymachus is also an egoist. One's own interests are the ultimate standard for how one should act. Note that the egoist does not counsel doing whatever one feels like doing at any moment, for that may not be in one's interest. Acting impulsively is often at odds with enlightened self-interest, so it is not something Thrasymachus endorses. And there may be times when following the rules will be to one's advantage, especially if one is likely to be caught and punished for breaking the rules. While it is almost always in one's interest to appear to be just, a point that Glaucon and Adeimantus will focus on in Book 2, it is rarely in one's interest to actually be just, Thrasymachus thinks. On his view, people who wish to be just are either naive simpletons who cluelessly enable their own exploitation, or they are savvy enough to recognize their own inability to act unjustly with impunity and so agree to the rules in order to protect themselves against those strong enough to do so. Justice is for the weak, he thinks. Those who reproach injustice do so because they are afraid not of doing it, but of suffering it. 5 arguments against Thrasymachus' definition of justice. There is more to say about Thrasymachus' definition of justice, but the best way to do that is to turn to the arguments Socrates gives against it. As with the conversations with Cephalus and Polemarchus, Socrates will argue from premises that Thrasymachus accepts to conclusions that are at odds with those premises. That is, he will try to show that Thrasymachus' view is at odds with itself, and thus that Thrasymachus himself has reason to discard or at least revise his view. Socrates makes 5 such arguments. The first 2 target Thrasymachus' answer to the Republic's first question about the nature of justice, that is, his claim that justice is whatever benefits the stronger. The last 3 target his answer to the Republic's second question about whether a just life is happier than an unjust one. We will take them each in turn. The error argument. I have dubbed the first argument the error argument because it turns on the possibility that rulers, being fallible, are prone to error in crafting laws. The argument is straightforward. Thrasymachus agrees that justice is or at least requires following laws laid down by the rulers. But rulers, being fallible, sometimes make mistakes and thus enact laws that are not in their own interests. So sometimes, at least justice is not what benefits the stronger. Since on Socrates' view an adequate definition of a thing's essence must not allow for exceptions, Thrasymachus' definition must be rejected or revised, since there are times when justice does not benefit the stronger. Reconstructed in premise-conclusion form, Socrates' error argument against Thrasymachus goes like this: P1 In a political system, the rulers are stronger than the ruled. P2 Justice is obedience to whatever the rulers command. P3 Rulers sometimes err and do not command what is to their advantage. So, justice is not, always, the advantage of the stronger. The argument seems deductively valid, that is, its conclusion must be true if its premises are true. Since Thrasymachus rejects the conclusion, rational consistency requires him to reject at least one of the premises. Hopefully this requirement makes sense. Since the argument is valid, if all its premises are true, its conclusion would have to be true. So if I think the conclusion of a valid argument is false, I cannot think that all the premises are in fact true, because if the premises were in fact true, the conclusion would be true, too. It is irrational to think that all the premises of a valid argument are in fact true and to think that the conclusion that follows from them is false. If I think the conclusion of a valid argument is false, I must also think at least one of the premises is false. Someone who does not value consistency will be unmoved by all of this. We have probably all encountered a kind of skepticism and perhaps embodied it with youthful exuberance that is skeptical about consistency itself. What is so great about consistency? Such a skeptic asks. Who cares if I am being inconsistent? If the skeptic is bookish, they might even quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson's well-known essay, Self-Reliance: A Foolish Consistency is the Hobgoblin of Little Minds, adored by little statesmen and philosophers and divines. Or they might appeal to F. Scott Fitzgerald's assertion in The Crack-Up that the test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in the mind at the same time, and still retain the ability to function. One way to respond to our skeptic is to point out that for Emerson the bogeyman wasn't consistency but rather foolish consistency. With consistency a great soul has simply nothing to do. Speak what you think now in hard words, and tomorrow speak what tomorrow thinks in hard words again, though it contradict everything you said today. It is refusing to change one's mind that Emerson is attacking here. And Fitzgerald is not questioning the value of consistency or celebrating inconsistency. He is concerned less with belief than he is with action. One should, for example, be able to see that things are hopeless and yet be determined to make them otherwise. There is nobility in fighting the good fight, he suggests, even when we do not believe we will succeed. Ultimately, though, if the skeptic continues to deny the value of consistency, there is little one can say to convince them otherwise, since rational argument depends upon consistency. Such a person is in effect demanding a sound argument for why they should find sound arguments persuasive. If they stick to their guns, there is no point in arguing with them. To do falls afoul of the folksy wisdom of a needlepoint pillow I happened upon years ago: never try to teach a pig to sing, it wastes your time and annoys the pig. Thrasymachus, whatever his other faults, is not this sort of skeptic. He is skeptical about the value of justice. We will soon see that he thinks it is a vice rather than a virtue, but he is not skeptical about the importance of consistency. Let us assume that Thrasymachus recognizes the argument as logically valid. Since it wasn't until Aristotle that anyone worked out the notion of logical validity, it is anachronistic to speak of Thrasymachus as recognizing the argument's validity, but doing so seems a harmless aid to clarity. If he wants to resist its conclusion, which presumably he does, since it says that his account of justice is false, he must think at least one of the premises is false. P1 seems unassailable, at least insofar as strength is understood in terms of political power. The lawmaking rulers are stronger than their subjects. P2 is never challenged by Thrasymachus or anyone else, despite Socrates bringing it up almost half a dozen times. I cannot help but think that these are winks or gentle nudges to prod readers to look more closely at P2. Thrasymachus agrees that it is just to obey the rulers, a proposition that he repeatedly assents to. It is just for their subjects to do whatever their rulers order, it is just for the others to obey the orders they give, it is just to obey the orders of the rulers. While obeying the law is typically just, we might ask whether it is always, unconditionally, just to do so, just as Socrates questions Cephalus' definition. Many readers will think that there is a presumption in favor of obeying the laws of our communities, obedience is the default position. But fewer will think that this presumption is exceptionless, for there seem to be times when this presumption does not hold. For example, if a law is unjust. Some thinkers, among them Thomas Aquinas and Martin Luther King, go even farther and think that unjust laws are not really laws at all but are counterfeits, and that we should no more obey them than we should accept a $20 bill we know to be counterfeit. P2, as I have stated it, does not merely claim that legal obedience is just, it claims that that is what justice is. It is a subtle but important difference, apparently unnoticed but accepted by Thrasymachus. When Socrates asks him, and whatever laws they make must be obeyed by their subjects, and this is justice, tau delta cap alpha iota omicron nu, to Decaen, the just, he replies, of course. By adding the definite article tau, that in English the adjective, just, gets promoted to a noun, the just, which is a typically Platonic way to talk about justice itself. On this view, all there really is to justice is obeying the rules, regardless of their content. Justice on such a view is merely a matter of convention, there are no minder culture-independent facts about whether something is really just or not. The only fact that makes something just is that it is a rule of one's community. If the laws of one's community mandate racial segregation, then justice requires obedience to them. Some readers, though fewer now than 60 years ago, will agree with this, holding that one should always obey the law, even laws one considers unjust, though one can work within the system to change unjust laws. Notice, too, that the conventionalism about justice expressed in P2 implies that there really is no standard by which to assess the laws of one's community as just or unjust. All there is to justice on such views is following whatever rules there are, regardless of their content, and there is no way to assess that content morally. Different communities have different rules, but if this deep cultural conventionalism or relativism is correct, no community's rules are better than any others, they are just different, and the same goes within a community over time. If a community allows slavery at time T1 but abolishes it at T2, the new legal code is not better, it is just different. This is something that few people are willing to accept, upon reflection. When we associate conventionalism and relativism with open-mindedness and tolerance of other cultures' practices and norms, they can seem attractive, but they often seem significantly less so when we examine their implications. To draw on some vocabulary developed in the previous chapter, this conventionalism about justice is an anti-realist view. There are no culture-independent moral facts by which to morally assess the laws and norms of one's culture. The contrast between nature and convention, between what is mind and culture independent and what is mind and culture dependent, is a pervasive theme in the Republic. The border between Illinois and Wisconsin seems purely conventional, the result of a decision to draw the line in a particular place. The border between Wisconsin and Minnesota seems more natural, since the Mississippi and St. Croix rivers are natural objects, existing whether we think they do or not. But even this boundary is not completely natural, since it is the border only because people decided it was. We have spent a lot of time on a view no one in the Republic mentions because I think Plato wants us, his readers, to do what his characters do not do, to think through issues that are ignored or given short shrift in the text. If we pause and double-click here, so to speak, examining the issues more thoroughly than Socrates' interlocutors do, we will be doing philosophy for ourselves. And if we do, we might well think that P2 is false, or at least in need of serious revision, even if no one in the Republic questions it. Despite Socrates' repeated prompting, Thrasymachus ignores P2. He will reject P3, which he initially assented to but now, on reflection, finds problematic. But before Thrasymachus addresses P3, Cleitophon tries to come to his rescue, suggesting that Thrasymachus' view is that justice is what the stronger believe to be to their advantage. In short, Cleitophon is suggesting that the error argument is irrelevant, since it misunderstands Thrasymachus' view. Polemarchus objects that is not what Thrasymachus said. It is telling how Socrates responds here. If Thrasymachus wants to put it that way now, let us accept it. This suggests that, contrary to what Thrasymachus says about him, Socrates is not primarily interested in winning an argument, he is interested in getting at the truth. If Cleitophon's revision more accurately reflects what Thrasymachus thinks, then that is what we should attend to, Socrates thinks. What he meant is more important than what he said, for Socrates. To think otherwise would be a foolish consistency indeed. Thrasymachus declines to go through the door Cleitophon has opened for him, however. Instead, he does what philosophers often do, he makes a distinction between different senses of a key term or concept. Here, Thrasymachus distinguishes between the ordinary and precise sense as ruler, claiming that P3 is true in the ordinary sense of ruler but false in the precise, philosophical sense. Thus he can consistently reject the argument's conclusion, since he thinks that P3, the seemingly plausible claim that rulers sometimes err and make laws that are not to their own advantage, is false, strictly speaking. In the strict or precise sense, rulers do not make mistakes, he claims. Do you think I'd call someone who is in error stronger at the very moment he errs? Thrasymachus asks. For all his bluster and swagger, Thrasymachus shows himself capable of subtle, philosophical thought when he distinguishes between the precise and ordinary senses of terms. When someone makes an error in the treatment of patients, Thrasymachus asks rhetorically, do you call him a doctor in regard to that very error? The same goes for accountants, grammarians, and any person said to possess a craft. A craftsperson, after all, possesses expertise and knowledge. The names for possessors of such expertise, carpenter, shepherd, doctor, teacher, etc., are not merely descriptive but are to an extent normative, indicating that their possessor has earned the right to be so called. Someone might be on the roster as quarterback or employed by the university as a teacher. But if they are so bad at their jobs, we might want to withhold the name. He's no quarterback, says the disgruntled football fan of a now-departed player. The fan is not saying that, say, Jay Cutler did not play that position. They would be likelier to say he is not a quarterback if the description is factually incorrect, if say the player were a linebacker and not a quarterback. Typically, she/he is no X, where X is a term for a craftsperson, makes the normative claim that the person in question is not good enough at their craft to merit the title. It is a normative issue, rather than a descriptive one, and it extends beyond names for craftspeople, as when someone says of rap or rock and roll or jazz, in their early days that's not music. This issue, by the way, is an important one in Confucianism. Confucius and especially his follower Xuanzi were concerned with the rectification of names, Jingming, given the importance of social roles to their thinking. Someone who regularly fails to display the required filial piety does not deserve to be called a son or, as Thrasymachus would put it, is not a son in the precise sense. So Thrasymachus thinks that while P3 of the error argument is true in the ordinary, descriptive sense of ruler, it is false in the precise, normative sense, and that is the relevant sense here. There is a certain logic to his view. Since a craftsperson is so called because they possess the requisite knowledge, when they make a mistake, they seem to lack this knowledge, or at least they are unable to act on it at that moment. It is when his knowledge fails him that he makes an error, Thrasymachus says, and in regard to that error he is no craftsman. No craftsman, expert, or ruler makes an error at the moment when he is ruling, even though everyone will say that a physician or a ruler makes errors. When he agreed with P3 earlier, he had the ordinary, imprecise sense in mind. But on the precise account, Socrates is a stickler for precise accounts. P3 is false, since no craftsman ever errs. There is certainly something to what Thrasymachus says. But is he overstating his case in holding that any error renders the craft title in question inapplicable? Does expertise really require such infallibility? A baseball player need not throw a perfect game in to be called pitcher in the precise sense. If Thrasymachus were right, there have only been 23 genuine pitchers in the history of Major League Baseball. It is not just that perfect games depend on more than the pitcher's skill. And it is not just a matter of human imperfection. Rather, it seems that some level of failure is consistent with possessing the relevant expertise, which is rarely an all-or-nothing matter. The best hitters in baseball, after all, make outs more often than they get hits. What level of imperfection is acceptable varies by craft. A batter who gets a hit only a third of the time is an excellent hitter. An orthopedic surgeon who successfully sets a broken bone for only a third of their cases seems far from competent. Thrasymachus' distinction between the precise and ordinary senses of ruler allows him to avoid accepting the conclusion that his definition of justice is false, since it allows him to claim, with some reason, that one of the argument's premises is false. Socrates does not challenge Thrasymachus' distinction between the ordinary and precise senses of ruler and, presumably, of other terms for experts in various crafts. Instead, he turns the distinction back against Thrasymachus in what we will call the craft argument. The craft argument. The heart of the craft argument is Socrates' insistence that craftspeople, in the strict sense, always seek to benefit their subjects, never themselves. Doctors, for example, insofar as they are doctors, seek to heal their patients, horse breeders seek to raise healthy horses, etc. If we think of craft knowledge as a kind of strength, as cognitive practical strength rather than physical strength, then the expertise the craftsperson possesses is a kind of strength, thus crafts rule over and are stronger than the things of which they are the craft. Stated in premise-conclusion form, the craft argument begins thus, P1. All crafts seek to benefit the objects over which they rule, not their practitioners. P2. All objects over which a craft rules are weaker than the craft, which is stronger. C1. So, all crafts seek to benefit the weaker, not the stronger. The argument is valid, and though Socrates has given only a few examples in support of P1, Thrasymachus accepts it. So far, so good. Now, to get to his desired conclusion that Thrasymachus' account of justice is false, Socrates has to assume that justice is a craft. There is no way to get to a conclusion about justice without a premise about justice. Since Socrates needs to make this assumption, let us state it clearly in the second half of the craft argument. P3 Justice is a craft. C2 Therefore, justice seeks to benefit the weaker, not the stronger. C3 Therefore, justice is not the advantage of the stronger. This half of the argument is valid, too. C2 follows from C1 and P3 by plugging justice into the general claim that all crafts seek to benefit the weaker. And then C3 follows from C2, because if justice seeks to benefit the weaker, then justice is not the advantage of the stronger. Thrasymachus' initial reaction to the conclusion is a lesson in how not to react rationally to an argument. Tell me, Socrates, do you still have a wet nurse? Because she is letting you run around with a snotty nose, and does not wipe it when she needs to. Needless to say, such insult-ridden responses, sadly not uncommon in cyberspace, do not pass philosophical muster. And Thrasymachus' second response is not much better. For rather than challenging one of Socrates' premises, as one should do when one rejects the conclusion of a valid argument, Thrasymachus does what many of us often do: he simply repeats his view, loudly and more stridently. Justice is really the good of another, the advantage of the stronger ruler, and harmful to the one who obeys and serves. His merely repeating his view rather than engaging with Socrates' objections to it echoes Polemarchus' reminder in the opening scene that one cannot be persuaded to change one's mind if one will not listen. Thrasymachus responding as he does is not terribly surprising when we remember his profession. He is a sophist, a wandering teacher of rhetoric, who teaches students how to make speeches in law courts. If he is any good at his job, he can teach his students to make a speech for or against any view. You want to argue that the defendant is guilty? Here's how you do that. You want to argue that the defendant is innocent? Here's how you do that. You want to figure out whether the defendant is really guilty or not? Not my department. He is a master of the art of disputation, engaging in what Plato calls heuristic, the etymology of which is telling. Eris was the Greek goddess of strife, but for her rolling an apple engraved to the fairest at a divine wedding reception, the Trojan War might not have happened. To be rho iota sigma tau iota kappa, eristikos, is to be fond of strife, to enjoy combat, at least the verbal variety. However effective good speeches are at persuading one's listeners of predetermined conclusions, they are not especially effective for arriving at philosophical conclusions. Socrates thinks his method of elenchus, the method of question and answer that proceeds from premises his interlocutor agrees to, is a better way to get at the truth. Now if you already know or, like Thrasymachus, think you know the truth about an issue, a rhetorically sound speech, or op-ed piece or book may be the best way to bring your audience around to your view. But if, like Socrates, you do not think you know the answer to the question, Socratic cross-examination seems a better way to get at the truth, whatever it will turn out to be. Whatever direction the argument blows us, Socrates says a bit later in the Republic, that is where we must go. Where Thrasymachus draws on his rhetorical skills to get to that predetermined end, Socrates will accept the answer that seems right to me after I have investigated the matter. This difference between their approaches is ultimately the difference between indoctrination and inquiry. It is a shame that Thrasymachus is unwilling or unable to query Socrates' argument, for it is not as airtight as Socrates seems to think it is. As is often the case in the Republic, we will have to do for one of the interlocutors what they cannot or will not do for themselves. For starters, Thrasymachus might question P1, the claim that all crafts seek to benefit their objects, not their practitioners. The trouble here is not that the argument Socrates gave in support of P1 is too brief, although it is that. From just a few examples of crafts that aim at the benefit of their objects rather than their practitioners, Socrates arrives at a general conclusion that all crafts are like this. Perhaps more examples would strengthen this inductive argument. A more serious problem with the craft argument is that Socrates himself provides a counterexample to its first premise when he introduces the craft of wage earning. Crafts are distinguished by their different ends and their different means for achieving their ends, that is, by their different functions. Every craft differs from every other in having a different function. The function of a doctor, in the precise sense, is healing patients, not making money. And similarly for the other crafts Socrates lists, navigation, horse breeding, etc. Making money is the function of a different craft, the craft of wage earning or money making. If doctors and horse breeders and ship captains and teachers benefit financially from practicing their crafts, it is because they possess another craft, the craft of wage earning. Many readers will be familiar with chefs and carpenters and doctors who are truly expert at their crafts but who lack business sense. At the other end of the spectrum are those famous for being famous celebrities whose only discernible skill is money-making, an ability to monetize their otherwise devoid of accomplishment existences. By now the point is probably obvious: the craft of money-making is practiced for the benefit of the practitioner. While medicine and teaching are other-focused, wage earning is self-focused, it benefits the craftsperson. And it is true that you might practice this craft altruistically, as when you want to earn more money so you can better provide for your family or community, but the craft itself aims to benefit the craftsperson. So right off the bat, Thrasymachus has grounds to resist the conclusion that his definition is false. Of course, the conclusion of an unsound argument might still be true. Just as there is nothing inconsistent about a juror thinking the defendant actually committed the crime in question but voting to acquit because the state did not prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt, there is nothing inconsistent in believing that the conclusion of an unsound or invalid argument is true. If Thrasymachus were more fair-minded, he might concede that his definition of justice might be false, but insist that Socrates has not shown that it is. Another and perhaps better option for Thrasymachus is to cast doubt on P3, the claim that justice is a craft. As noted above, this is an implicit assumption of the argument, not an explicit claim, though Socrates did assert it earlier, in arguing against Polemarchus. What does the craft we call justice give, and to whom or what does it give it? This would be a good move for Thrasymachus to make, since we already have good reason to think that P3 is false. While crafts and character virtues are similar in many ways, crafts are morally neutral whereas character virtues are not. If justice is not a craft, then the general claim that crafts are other-focused would not apply to it. Now it looks like the argument is doubly unsound, since we have good reason to doubt both P1 and P3, so Thrasymachus is not rationally compelled to accept its conclusion. Socrates might reply that even if justice is not a craft, ruling is. But then the craft argument's conclusion needs to be changed as well, which stymies Socrates' attempt to make progress toward understanding what justice is by showing what it is not. The argument so modified would not be a refutation of Thrasymachus' definition of justice, but rather of the view that rulers, in the precise sense, seek not their own benefit but rather the benefit of those they rule. We might think this is true, at least of good rulers, but Thrasymachus could here raise the problems with P1, reminding Socrates that his own example of wage earning is a counterexample to the general claim that crafts are not practiced primarily for the benefit of the craftsperson. Why not think ruling is analogous to wage earning, Thrasymachus could ask, and aims at the benefit of the ruler? At the very least, Socrates has not given him compelling reasons to think that it is not. An important lesson here is how interlinked the arguments of the Republic are. Earlier I suggested that the important conclusion to draw from Socrates' attempted refutation of Polemarchus was not the one he explicitly drew, but rather that justice and other moral virtues are not crafts. Whether this was the lesson Plato hoped we'd learn is beside the point, at least to the extent that one goal in reading the Republic is to do philosophy ourselves, to engage in imaginary dialogue with Socrates as we try to get at or at least close to the truth of the matter. If the assumption that justice is a craft is false, its reappearing as a premise here undermines the craft argument. The outdoing argument. Even if the craft argument is unsound, it explicitly raises the Republic's second main question of whether the just life is happier than the unjust life. This question's urgency leads Socrates to leapfrog the more theoretical question of the nature of justice in favor of the practical question of which whole way of life would make living most worthwhile for each of us. Modern moral philosophy often focuses on particular actions, especially choices and dilemmas. Sometimes the dilemmas are intentionally artificial, to bring out larger moral principles lurking in the background. Many readers will be familiar with the trolley problem and its numerous variations. Is it permissible to divert a runaway trolley car onto a track where it will kill one worker if doing so will save 5 people working on the track the trolley is on? Other times, the dilemmas are more the stuff of everyday life. Is aborting a pre-viability fetus permissible or not? Socrates' question is far more general than these, as it concerns whole ways of life rather than particular actions. It concerns not so much what we ought to do as the way we ought to live. Socrates' approach focuses on persons rather than actions and takes the unit of evaluation to be lives rather than choices and actions. This approach, known as virtue ethics, has enjoyed a resurgence among moral philosophers in recent years, and though virtue ethicists often look to Aristotle for inspiration, we see its roots in the ethical thought of Plato and Socrates. This virtue-centric concern comes to the fore almost immediately in the third of Socrates' arguments against Thrasymachus, the outdoing argument, to which we now turn. Since Socrates has shifted his attention from the first to the second of the Republic's main questions, his aim now is not to refute Thrasymachus' definition of justice, but rather Thrasymachus' claim that complete injustice is more profitable than complete justice. The question of whether a just life is happier than an unjust one has great practical implications, given the overwhelmingly plausible assumption that each of us wants to be happy. Few of us would dispute that the just life is morally better than the unjust life. The issue here is whether the just life is prudentially better, whether, as we put it in the introduction, having a good life requires leading a good life. Thrasymachus thinks not, since a just man always gets less than an unjust one. If Thrasymachus is right about which life is happier, then each of us has a strong reason to act unjustly. If a just or morally good life is always at odds with happiness, living a just life will inevitably frustrate a core desire each of us has. Socrates argues that, despite its apparent plausibility, Thrasymachus' view is profoundly mistaken, since morality and happiness are not fundamentally at odds with each other. Far from being an impediment to happiness, a just life is at least a necessary condition of a happy life, on Socrates' view, since we cannot be happy unless we are just. Thrasymachus understands happiness in terms of material success, in terms of power and its trappings. On his view, the more a person gets, the happier they will be. Life is a competition between people striving to outdo each other, where the winner is the person who is able to bend others to their will. Few people, I trust, try to inculcate Thrasymachus' materialism and egoism in their children. Socrates' last words, nearly, to the jury that found him guilty of impiety and sentenced him to death, are a request for a favor.
When my sons grow up, gentlemen, if you think they are putting money or anything else before goodness, take your revenge by plaguing them as I have plagued you, and if they fancy themselves for no reason, you must scold them as I scolded you, for neglecting the important things and thinking they are good for something when they are good for nothing. If you do this, I shall have had justice at your hands, both I myself and my children.
Despite his profound disagreement with Thrasymachus' materialistic conception of human flourishing, Socrates does not argue directly against it, but instead, in a pattern that by now is familiar, he tries to show Thrasymachus that a key premise he believes in here, that the unjust person outdoes everyone else, does not support and in fact is at odds with the conclusion Thrasymachus holds. This notion of outdoing is central to the outdoing argument. The Greek word is pi lambda epsilon omicron nu epsilon xi alpha, pleonexia. Etymologically, it is a combination of pleon, more, and achein, to have. Thrasymachus' unjust person wants to have more than anyone else and recognizes no legitimate moral constraints on his pursuit of his goal. Fans of classic cinema will find a fine example of pleonexia in John Huston's 1948 film, Key Largo, starring Humphrey Bogart, Lauren Bacall, and Edward G. Robinson. In a confrontation between Frank McCloud, Bogart, and Johnny Rocco, Robinson, McCloud tells captive innkeeper James Temple, Lionel Barrymore, that he knows what Rocco wants.
McCloud, he wants more, don't you, Rocco? Rocco, yeah. That's it. More. That's right. I want more. Temple, will you ever get enough? McCloud, will you, Rocco? Rocco, well, I never have. No, I guess I won't. Do you know what you want? McCloud, yes, I had hopes once, but I gave them up. Rocco, hopes for what? McCloud, a world in which there's no place for Johnny Rocco.
Rocco's insatiable desire for more is the heart of pleonexia. It is almost as though the object of this desire is secondary. Whatever people want, the pleonectic person wants more of it, wants to outdo everyone else. The rest of us, not strong enough to bend others to our wills to get what we want, live in fear of the Johnny Roccos of the world, those immoral creatures who are strong enough to bend us to their will to get what they want. Glaucon, playing devil's advocate, will soon articulate the Thrasymachus view that justice is a deal the weak make to protect themselves against the caprice of the stronger. Those who reproach injustice, Thrasymachus says, do so not because they are afraid of doing it, but of suffering it. If enough of us weak folk band together and gain political power, we can make laws that protect us against the Thrasymachuses and Roccos of the world. After all, that is all justice is. In the conventionalist view Thrasymachus articulated at the outset, the rules the politically powerful make to serve their own interests. We should note, though, that Thrasymachus shifts gears at the outset of the outdoing argument and articulates a view that does not square with his conventionalism. For he counts injustice not as a vice, but as a virtue.
Socrates, do you call one of the two a virtue and the other a vice? Thrasymachus, of course. Socrates, that is to say, you call justice a virtue and injustice a vice? Thrasymachus, that is hardly likely, since I say that injustice is profitable and justice is not. Socrates, do you really include injustice with virtue and wisdom, and justice with their opposites? Thrasymachus, I certainly do.
Thrasymachus is here articulating immoralism, the view that what most people think of as the wrong way to act is actually the right way, what are conventionally thought to be character vices are actually virtues. Unlike the conventionalism Thrasymachus expressed earlier, immoralism is a realist view. There are mind-independent moral facts that provide standards by which to evaluate a society's conventions and norms. Athenian culture takes justice to be a virtue and injustice to be a vice. Here, Thrasymachus is saying that Athenian culture get this backwards, since injustice is really the virtue and justice the vice. Thrasymachus' immoralism makes sense when we pair the last chapter's discussion of what a virtue is with his materialistic conception of human flourishing. A virtue is the condition that enables a thing to perform its function well. So a knife's virtue is sharpness, since that is what enables the knife to cut well. If our function is to outdo others, to get more stuff, then of course injustice is a virtue, injustice is a vice, since injustice enables and justice prevents our getting more than others. A just man always gets less than an unjust one, 1.343d. Socrates notices the challenge posed by Thrasymachus' shift to immoralism. It is not easy to know what to say, in light of Thrasymachus jettisoning the moral order that would usually serve as the background of a conversation like this. But he cannot simply presuppose the usual background without begging the question, that is, without assuming the truth of what he is trying to prove against Thrasymachus. He needs to argue against Thrasymachus' immoralism, not just assume it is wrong and that the traditional moral order, on which justice is a virtue and injustice a vice, is correct. Socrates' direct target in the outdoing argument is Thrasymachus' immoralist view that justice is the vice and injustice is the virtue. If he can show this, he will knock out the support for Thrasymachus' view that the unjust life is happier than the just life. Thrasymachus thinks that an unjust person tries to outdo everyone, and if they are sufficiently good at being bad, they will succeed. He thinks that the just person, by contrast, is a simpleton, easily duped by the more crafty and complicated unjust person. Socrates gets Thrasymachus to agree that the just person seeks to outdo only unjust people, but Thrasymachus is skeptical that the person will succeed at this, being so polite and innocent. Socrates once again appeals to the analogy between crafts and virtues. A craftsperson, he argues, tries to outperform the person lacking the craft in question, while the craft-lacking person tries to outdo everyone. Thrasymachus agrees to this, and also to Socrates' claim that a craftsperson is wise and good, which makes sense at least with respect to the craft in question. A skilled carpenter possesses a kind of technical wisdom, knowing how to build a wraparound deck or a roll-top desk, for example. The person who lacks the craft, by contrast, is ignorant and bad. They lack the craftsperson's knowledge and are not, for example, a good carpenter. They are not properly called a carpenter at all, if Thrasymachus' earlier point about the precise sense of craft terms is correct. The craftsperson, Socrates thinks, wants to perform the craft in question better than someone who lacks it, not someone who possesses it. They want to outdo those unlike them, not those like them. The craft-lacking person, by contrast, wants to outperform everyone, both those like them and those unlike them. Similarly, the just person wants to outdo unjust people, those unlike them, while the unjust person wants to outdo everyone, both those like and those unlike them. If all of this is correct, the just person resembles the craftsperson, since each wants to outdo only those unlike them, the unjust and craft-lacking person, while the unjust person resembles the craft-lacking person, wanting to outdo everyone, both those unlike them and those like them. Since each of them has the qualities of the people he is like, and Thrasymachus has agreed that the craftsperson is good and wise, while the craft-lacking person is neither, it follows that the just person is good and wise, while the unjust person is neither. From there it is a short trip to the conclusion that justice is virtue and wisdom, and that injustice is vice and ignorance. Since most of us, I assume, are not immoralists, we will agree with Socrates' conclusion. But as often is the case in Book 1, Socrates' argument for his conclusion is problematic. The first problem is that the argument relies on the analogy between crafts and virtues, a troublesome analogy that bedevils much of Book 1. Given the difference between character virtues and crafts, the latter are morally neutral while the former are not. Why should Thrasymachus accept the claim that each has the qualities of the one he resembles? After all, the kinds of knowledge the just and skilled persons require are very different. In possessing a skill, the craftsperson possesses a morally neutral knowledge of how to do certain things. As Socrates noted in his argument with Polemarchus, the craftsperson can use their skills for good or ill. A doctor can use their medical expertise to heal or kill. Even someone who possesses a skill that seems intrinsically bad, imagine, say, an assassin can use that skill for good ends as well as bad. Assassinating Hitler seems a good thing. The lesson here is that arguments from analogy rise and fall on the presence of relevant similarities and dissimilarities, respectively, between the things being compared. Given the important dissimilarity between crafts and virtues, Thrasymachus would be right to push back on this premise. Another problem with the outdoing argument, which many readers will have already noticed, is that its very first premise, the claim that the skilled person seeks to outdo only the unskilled person rather than another skilled person, seems to be not merely false, but obviously false. Socrates is probably correct that when it comes to tuning the lyre player wants to do better than a non-musician. Where there is one correct way to do something, genuine experts will do that thing in the same way. But when it comes to playing the lyre, for example, rather than merely tuning it, a skilled musician does not merely want to play better than a non-musician. That is not much of an achievement. They want to outperform another lyre player. Readers might be puzzled by Socrates' confident assertion that a doctor, when prescribing food and drink, wants to outdo a non-doctor, given how competitive doctors can be. Some doctors are better diagnosticians than others, some cellists are better at playing Bach than others, some philosophers are better at interpreting Plato than others, some investors are better at spotting undervalued companies than others, etc. Developing these skills is often fueled at least in part by competition and a desire to outperform, to outdo, as Socrates puts it, other experts, the desire to be the best at xing, whatever x may be. So even setting aside the disanalogy between crafts and virtues, the outdoing argument flounders because its key premise is false or at least highly questionable. At the very least, it needs more defense than it gets. Even if we agree with Socrates that Thrasymachus' immoralism is mistaken, we can see that the outdoing argument is far from conclusive against it. Perhaps a lesson here is that being too personally invested in one's views, as Thrasymachus seems to be, can get in the way of adequately defending them. If I see your argument as refuting me rather than refuting a view I hold, as attacking me as a person rather than a premise or principle I subscribe to, I may well react as Thrasymachus does. Earlier he responded to the error argument with a literally snotty put-down of Socrates. Here he is tamer in defeat, blushing and producing a quantity of sweat that was a wonder to behold. But clearly a more dispassionate attitude would serve him better. After all, if the goal is to discover the truth about justice, seeing that one's view was mistaken is actually something to welcome, since by clearing away false views we get closer to the truth. Such an attitude is a tall order for most of us, but even if we think it is not fully achievable, given human nature, it does present an ideal to which we can aspire. The common purpose argument. There is a discernible change in Thrasymachus' demeanor after the outdoing argument, one noted by Glaucon towards the beginning of Book 2. I think that Thrasymachus gave up before he had to, charmed by you as if he were a snake. Thrasymachus thinks his immoralism, a view he regarded as bold and daring, has been refuted, and since speech-making has been ruled out, he announces that he will just agree with Socrates from here on. In again urging Thrasymachus not to answer contrary to his own opinion, Socrates reminds us of the nature of Socratic cross-examination, which is personal in the sense of its aiming to help the person being questioned to discover the truth by examining how well their views hang together, or if they hang together at all. Especially when the topic is an important one like justice, being in error can have disastrous consequences. In the conclusion of Book 1 of his treatise of human nature, David Hume famously said, "Generally speaking, the errors in religion are dangerous, those in philosophy only ridiculous." Socrates could not disagree more, since so much hangs on the philosophical question of whether the just life is happier than the unjust life. Hume, in response, would think that philosophical questions have far less effect on how we live our lives than Socrates thinks. Far from being able to govern our conduct, reason is and not only to be the slave of the passions, and can never pretend to any office than to serve and obey them. If Thrasymachus is mistaken that the unjust life is a happier life, this mistake is not merely theoretical or conceptual or abstractly philosophical, for the argument concerns no ordinary topic but the way we ought to live. It is a mistake that will have profound implications for the quality of one's life. If Socrates is right about justice, then Thrasymachus' view is a prescription for a life of glittering misery. So it is a shame that Thrasymachus gives up, for the final two arguments of Book 1 deserve more scrutiny than they get. The first of these is the common purpose argument, which aims to refute Thrasymachus' claim that injustice is stronger and more powerful than justice. This claim is implied by the immoralist view that Socrates tried to refute with the outdoing argument. Thrasymachus thinks that injustice empowers its possessor to outdo everyone, to take control of and rule a city-state. Socrates argues that Thrasymachus has woefully misidentified injustice as power. Injustice has the power, first, to make whatever it arises in, whether it is a city, a family, an army, or anything else incapable of achieving anything as a unit, because of the civil wars and differences it creates, and, second, it makes that unit an enemy to itself. Socrates' idea is that even a criminal gang cannot successfully achieve its goals unless some kind of justice regulates the gangsters' dealings with each other. Spelled out in premise-conclusion form, the common purpose argument goes something like this: P1. If X enables successful common action and Y prevents this, then X is stronger than Y. P2. Justice enables and injustice prevents successful common action. C. Therefore, justice is stronger than injustice. The argument is logically valid. Its conclusion must be true if its premises are true, and its premises seem in fact true, so it is sound, to boot. As the preceding arguments have all been problematic, this success almost seems worth celebrating. But before Socrates and company start with the ancient Athenian equivalent of high-fiving, they would do well to pause and note that even if the argument is sound, the conclusion it establishes seems too weak, for it shows that justice is merely instrumentally good, useful for any group to achieve its goals, be they just or unjust. Socrates thinks that justice, and especially a reputation for possessing it, is instrumentally good, but presumably he wants to show that justice is also intrinsically good, that its goodness is internal and not dependent merely on the external benefits it brings about, that all by itself it makes its possessor better off. If justice helps a criminal enterprise be more unjust, then it is hard to see how it is a moral virtue. Instead, it seems to be just another skill or craft and merely conditionally good. It is good when aimed at good ends and bad when aimed at bad ends. So even though the common purpose argument is sound, it does not seem to prove what it ought to prove. It is a shame that Thrasymachus' wounded pride prevents him from challenging the common purpose argument. If he had, Socrates might have given it up, or perhaps on reflection he might have regrouped and responded that the argument shows at least that Thrasymachus' immoralism is incorrect. After all, Thrasymachus thinks injustice is a virtue, injustice is a vice, because the former enables and the latter prevents its possessor from achieving happiness. Immoralism implies that injustice is stronger than justice. So in showing that the opposite is true, that justice is stronger than injustice, Socrates shows that immoralism is false. So even if the common purpose argument comes to the wrong conclusion about the nature of justice, it still packs a punch against Thrasymachus' immoralism. The function argument. The last argument in Book 1 reprises and repurposes some concepts employed earlier in Book 1 and discussed in the last chapter, especially the nature of a virtue. Socrates seems to regard it as a knockdown argument that the just life is happier than the unjust life, but we will see that even he is ultimately dissatisfied with it. The ideas of virtue and function came up earlier in Book 1, in one of Socrates' arguments against Polemarchus' view that justice is helping friends and harming enemies. A thing's function is its goal-directed purpose, the activity characteristic of things of its kind. So a knife's function is cutting, a heart's function is pumping blood, etc. Socrates defines the function of a horse or anything else as that which one can do only with it or best with it. So even though one can cut with a spoon or a fingernail, cutting is a knife's function since a knife cuts best. A virtue, we have seen, is what enables a thing to perform its function well. Anything that has a function performs it well by means of its own peculiar virtue and badly by means of its vice. Thus a knife's virtue is sharpness, because sharpness enables a knife to cut well. Since we make knives and other tools to perform certain tasks, it is easy to see an artifact's function and virtue. But natural objects like hearts, eyes, and kidneys have functions, too. And indeed, in the function argument, Socrates is concerned about the function and virtue of the soul, psyupsilon kai, sush, whence the word psyche. The upsilon is often transliterated as a y, so sush becomes psyche, for example. Though Socrates will later argue that the soul is immortal, it is best not to read any religious beliefs into soul here. Instead, think of a soul as a life force. All living things have souls on this view. Indeed, Aristotle will distinguish between vegetative souls, which enable metabolic processes, sentient souls, which enable feeling and locomotion, and rational souls, which enable thought. Humans, he thinks, have all three, and non-human animals have the first two. Thus Socrates asks, what of living? Is not that a function of a soul? He then claims, and Thrasymachus half-heartedly agrees, that justice is a soul's virtue and injustice its vice. He made this claim earlier, in the argument with Polemarchus, but is not justice human virtue? Just as a sharp knife cuts well, a just soul lives well. And what is happiness but living well? Thus Socrates concludes that a just person is happy, and an unjust one is wretched. Spelled out in premise-conclusion form, the function argument looks like this. P1. A thing's virtue enables its function to be performed well. P2. Living is a function of the soul. P3. Justice is a soul's virtue, injustice a vice. C1. So, the just person lives well, the unjust person lives poorly. P4. Happiness is living well, unhappiness is living poorly. C2. So, the just person is happy, the unjust person is unhappy. The argument is logically well constructed. If its premises are true, its conclusions must be true. But even if we agree with Socrates that its premises are true, we might wish that Thrasymachus would push back a bit, for it is not clear that we are justified in thinking them true. P1 is unproblematic, it is just a definition of what a virtue or excellence is. But we might worry that P2 is weaker than it needs to be. Living needs to be the function of the soul, not merely a function of the soul, for the argument to work. While one cannot be just or unjust, for that matter if one is not alive, it is hard to see how mere biological life is the issue here. A deeper worry is P3, which Thrasymachus is already on record as rejecting. On his immoralist view, injustice is the virtue and justice the vice. While we might agree that Socrates was right to reject Thrasymachus' immoralism, if we are fair-minded we should concede that his argument for doing so leaves much to be desired, relying on both a false equivalence between skills and virtues and on the false premise that the skilled person seeks to outdo only the unskilled person. The common purpose argument gives an indirect reason for thinking P3 is true and thus that Thrasymachus' immoralism is false, but it is overly dependent on the bad analogy between skills and virtues. What Thrasymachus should do, but does not do, is to push back and argue that Socrates may well be correct that the just life is happier, but the function argument does not prove it, since two of its key premises may well be false, and at the very least Socrates has not given us reasons for thinking they are true. Book 1 would be very different if Thrasymachus gave Socrates more of a run for his money. Socrates himself is dissatisfied at the end of Book 1, and he seems to implicitly acknowledge that his arguments, especially the last one, rely on premises that Thrasymachus finds doubtful and that even sympathetic but fair-minded readers wish were better supported. Moreover, Socrates recognizes a flaw in his procedure. He started to address the Republic's second question of which life is happier before answering the first question on the nature of justice. It is a moment of typical Socratic insight. The result of the discussion, as far as I am concerned, is that I know nothing, for when I do not know what justice is, I will hardly know whether it is a kind of virtue or not, or whether a person who has it is happy or unhappy. So Socrates himself realizes that he is not really justified in asserting the function argument's key premise, P3. It is not that he thinks it is false, he has not gone over to Thrasymachus immoralism. But he recognizes that he has not given the immoralist a good reason to change their mind, and he has not given himself a good reason to believe what he believes. Several years ago, Donald Rumsfeld's talk of the known unknown was held up to some ridicule or at least befuddlement in the popular media. But one need not approve of Rumsfeld's role in the Second Gulf War to appreciate the essentially Socratic nature of the point he was making. There are things that we know, and we know that we know them, our names, where we live, etc. And there are things that many of us do not know: what the capital of Belarus is, Ted Williams' lifetime batting average, how to play the cello, and we probably know that we do not know them. But it is those things that we do not even know that we do not know that can be a source of trouble, as any student who discovers, during an exam, that they now know that they do not know something. Had they come to this higher-order awareness before the exam, they could have asked their professor or a classmate for help. As is so often the case in other areas of life, timing is everything in moving from not knowing that we do not know something to knowing that we do not know it. Coming to this kind of higher-order knowledge is often an epiphany. It certainly was for Socrates when he realized that his wisdom consisted in his not thinking he knew what he did not know, in his knowing what he did not know. And the same goes at the end of Book 1, when he realizes that he does not yet know what justice is, and thus that the arguments he has given that the just life is happier rely on premises he is really not entitled to assert. He is displaying a kind of intellectual humility that is sadly in short supply in our age, as it was in his. Even if his interlocutors have not challenged him when they could have and should have, Socrates does not let himself get away with thinking he knows something he does not know. While Book 1 ends on a down note, we will see in the next chapter that there is reason yet for optimism. Chapter 3. A fresh start. Socrates is not the only one who is dissatisfied with the results, the non-results, really, of Book 1. Glaucon and Adeimantus feel let down, too. It is not that they have been convinced by Thrasymachus. Quite the contrary. They agree with Socrates that the just life is happier than the unjust life, but they do not find Socrates' arguments persuasive, and thus they recognize that they cannot defend or justify that belief to themselves or others. We could put their predicament thus: they believe that the just life is happier, but they do not know that it is, and they know that they do not know this. When thinking about knowledge more precisely, about propositional or factual knowledge, the kind of knowledge involved in knowing that certain claims are true, in contrast to the knowing how to do certain things, the sort of knowledge that is distinctive of the skills and crafts discussed in earlier chapters, a good place to start is to think of knowledge as a matter of justified true belief. On the JTB conception of knowledge, so-called because it defines knowledge as justified true belief, I know that the White Sox won the 2005 World Series because I believe that they won. My belief that they did is justified, since it is based on good reasons. I watched and rewatched the deciding game. I have confirmed their victory on various reliable websites, etc., and that belief is true. We all have various beliefs that are true but unjustified, and beliefs that are false but justified. For example, looking at the usually reliable and accurate clock on my office wall, I form the belief that it is 8:30 and thus that I still have time for some last-minute preparation and perhaps another coffee before my 9 o'clock class. But unbeknownst to me, the clock is malfunctioning because of a power surge, and it is actually 9:15, and most of my students have given up on me. Even though my belief is false, it seems justified, since my evidence is a clock that has always been reliable. More on point, though, are cases in which my belief is true but unjustified. Suppose that I know that my clock is wildly inconsistent, speeding up and slowing down with no rhyme or reason. Even so, I come to believe that it is 8 o'clock after glancing at the clock. Even if it is 8 o'clock, I am inclined to think that I do not know that it is 8 o'clock, because my belief, while true, is not justified. It is based on evidence I myself regard as unreliable. Similarly, suppose I just have a feeling that the White Sox will win today, and suppose further that my gut feelings about the outcomes of baseball games are not especially reliable, being wrong at least as often as they are right. Even if the Sox win, you would be right to disagree when I say, I knew they would win today, since a crucial element in knowledge, namely justification, is missing. Even though the JTB conception of knowledge does not feature in the Republic, it has its roots in another of Plato's dialogues, the Theaetetus, where Socrates and Theaetetus consider, among other things, whether it is true judgment with an account, lambda gamma omicron, logos, that is knowledge. They ultimately reject the JTB account because, ironically, they cannot come up with a satisfactory account of what an account or reason is. We will see in Chapter 8 that Socrates has a very different conception of knowledge in the Republic. But even though the JTB conception of knowledge lacks Platonic bona fides, not to mention contemporary philosophical disagreements about what justifies beliefs and indeed about whether knowledge is best thought of as JTB, it is helpful in understanding the dynamics of Books 2 and 3. Glaucon and Adeimantus, having been raised properly, have, let us assume, a true belief about the relation between justice and happiness. But they recognize that they lack a justification for this true belief, and they hope Socrates can help provide them with one. We saw in the previous chapter that Socrates' arguments in support of this belief leave a great deal to be desired, a fact of which Socrates as well as Glaucon and Adeimantus are painfully aware. Thrasymachus, for his part, would insist that Glaucon and Adeimantus do not know that the just life is happier, not because they lack a justification for their true belief, but because their belief is false. The just life is not happier than the unjust life, on his view. The most striking feature of their request for help is their asking Socrates not to proceed as he did in Book 1 and give us, yet another, theoretical argument that justice is stronger than injustice. Nor are they asking Socrates to become more like Thrasymachus and give long speeches. But they also do not want him to crank out argument after argument, as he did in Book 1. They are reasonably bright young men, but they are not philosophically sophisticated, and want something that is convincing without being too abstract. Glaucon's approach in seeking a justification for his belief that the just life is happier is twofold. First, he makes a distinction between three different kinds of goods, which will help them clarify the kind of good Socrates should show justice to be. Second, he articulates three claims or theses that he thinks capture the heart of Thrasymachus' position, adopting the role of devil's advocate. It is not, Glaucon assures Socrates, that he believes any of these Thrasymachine claims. But if Socrates can show him how to refute these theses, Glaucon's belief that the just life is happier will inch closer to being justified. Three kinds of goods. There is healthy scholarly disagreement about the details of Glaucon's division of goods, but we can get a good sense of the division without getting tripped up in a scholarly tangle. For the sake of clarity, I will depart slightly from Glaucon's ordering, switching the second and third categories. The first kind of good comprises intrinsic goods, which we welcome not because we desire what comes from it, but, for its own sake joy, for example, and all the harmless pleasures that have no results beyond the joy of having them. The idea is that we value certain things, experiences, and activities in and for themselves, and not for their consequences. This way of putting it is not quite right, though. Possessing these goods makes our lives go better, and having one's life go better because one possesses X seems to be a consequence of possessing X. We can get clearer about what Glaucon means if we think of the relation between such goods and a good life as a part-whole relation rather than a means-end relation. Enjoying a sunset is not a means to having a good life, it is part of a good life. To modify an example from the philosopher John Ackerell, which he made in a different but related context, driving to a golf course is a means to playing a round of golf that is external to the game. I drive to the course in order to play a round. I drive the ball off the tee and putt in order to play a round of golf, but these activities are not external means to playing golf, as driving to the course is. They are constituent elements or internal parts of playing a round of golf. So Glaucon's intrinsic goods are constituent parts or elements of a good life conceived as a whole. They are not external, instrumental means to such a life. Where first category goods are best thought of in terms of the part-whole relation, the second category, which Glaucon takes third, contains things, activities, and experiences that are best thought of as means to an end external to them. We can think of such goods as instrumental rather than intrinsic goods. Glaucon takes them to be onerous but beneficial, valued not in themselves, but for the rewards and other things that come from them. Physical training and medical treatment, and, it will later turn out, governing, are offered as examples of such instrumental goods. There is a certain subjectivity here, though, as some people find physical training enjoyable in itself, even apart from its instrumental benefits. Some people love running, for example, enjoying the activity itself, others loathe it, valuing it only for the benefits it brings. We might put the difference this way: the lovers enjoy running, while the loathers enjoy having run. Flossing one's teeth seems an everyday example of an onerous but beneficial purely instrumental good. We do it not because it is enjoyable in itself, but because of its good results, healthier gums and fewer lectures about the importance of flossing from finger-wagging dentists. But a person who enjoys the activity itself is not making a mistake, they merely have preferences and tastes that are not widely shared. The third kind of good, which Glaucon takes second, is mixed, comprising intrinsic and instrumental goods, a kind of good we like for its own sake and also for the sake of what comes from it. For some people, physical exercise is completely a second category good, onerous but beneficial, instrumentally good but intrinsically bad. But for others it belongs to this third, mixed category. One recognizes the health benefits of running 5 miles every day, but one also enjoys the activity itself. And perhaps watching that sunset relaxes you and lowers your blood pressure, so it too might be a mixed good. Glaucon and Socrates regard goods of this third category as the best kind of goods, since they combine both intrinsic and instrumental goodness. It might be that the drive to the golf course is lovely and thus valuable both intrinsically, since you enjoy it in itself, and also instrumentally, since it is an efficient way to get to the golf course. Where does justice belong? Most people, Glaucon says on behalf of Thrasymachus, place it in the second category of things and activities that are intrinsically bad but instrumentally good, to be valued not for their intrinsic features but for the external benefits they bring, especially the benefits of having a reputation for being just. Most people, say that justice belongs to the onerous kind, and is to be practiced for the sake of the rewards and popularity that come from having a reputation for justice, but is to be avoided because of itself as something burdensome. Socrates and Glaucon, by contrast, think justice is the best kind of good, belonging in the third, mixed category, to be valued, both because of itself and because of what comes from it. Even though acting justly will not always be easy, its being challenging does not make it onerous, something one wishes one did not have to do, any more than running a marathon is onerous and to be avoided in virtue of its being difficult or challenging. The question of justice's proper categorization shapes the rhetorical strategy of the rest of the Republic in an important way. Most people only halfway agree with Glaucon's classification of justice. They concede the instrumental value of having a reputation for justice, of seeming to be just, but they deny justice's intrinsic value, holding that being just is not by itself good. Thus what Glaucon and Adeimantus want from Socrates is to show them that a just life is intrinsically good, all by itself. It makes its possessor's life go well. There is no need to try to show that a reputation for it is instrumentally good, since that is conceded on all sides. Even Thrasymachus could agree with this. To show that justice is intrinsically good, they need to find a way to bracket off and ignore its instrumental value. If they do not do this, they cannot be sure that justice is being valued intrinsically, in and for itself, rather than for its extrinsic benefits. Thus it will not be enough to compare the just and unjust persons. To ignore the instrumental benefits a reputation for justice brings, Socrates must draw on the distinction between being and seeming and saddle the just person with a reputation for injustice. If he can show that the person who is just but seems unjust is happier than the person who is unjust but seems just, he will have shown that justice is intrinsically good, that all by itself it makes its possessor's life better. Glaucon's 3 Thrasymachan theses. Let us now turn to the second prong of Glaucon's challenge, his devil's advocacy of Thrasymachus' view. We should pause to appreciate what good intellectual practice Glaucon models here. To understand an opponent's view well enough to be able to state it clearly and forcefully and fairly is not easy, but it is a hallmark of intellectual fairness. Most of us are more familiar with someone's arguing against a view by presenting and then rejecting a caricature of the view in question. To argue this way is to commit what is known as the strawman fallacy, so-called because strawmen and women are so easy to knock over. To take an obvious contemporary example, consider arguments about the morality of abortion. Most of us have probably heard arguments like these: of course abortion is immoral, those who think it is not seem to think it is okay to murder babies, and of course abortion is permissible, those who think it is not seem to think a woman should have no right at all to decide what happens to her body. Both of these arguments commit the strawman fallacy. It is a safe bet that no defender of the moral permissibility of abortion takes pleasure at the thought of murdering babies, nor does the typical opponent relish the opportunity to interfere with a woman's bodily autonomy. Indeed, the phrase "they seem to think that" is a fairly reliable indicator that a strawman fallacy is coming your way. Now it may be that strawman characterizations are rhetorically effective, they are no doubt good ways to energize the base. But they are intellectually debased ways of providing reasons in support of one's view, whatever that view may be. There is nothing wrong with arguing for one's view by arguing against an opponent's view, but intellectual integrity requires that we characterize the opponent's position fairly and charitably, such that they will recognize it as theirs, and that it appears to be a view that a reasonable person might hold, rather than as seems sadly typical a view that only a morally corrupt, irrational person would find compelling. Thrasymachan thesis number 1. Justice is conventional, not natural. The distinction between nature, phi sigma iota, physis, whence the word physics, and convention, pneumo-omicron, nomos, whence words like economics, is common in the Republic. In one sense, what is natural is what is real or true independently of what anyone thinks or does, while what is conventional is true or real only in virtue of a decision one or one's culture makes. The difference between rivers and trees is a natural difference, not a conventional one, but borders between states are matters of convention, even when the border is a natural object such as a river. In a different but related sense, a thing's nature is what makes it the kind of thing it is: a knife rather than a fork, a plant rather than an animal, etc. In his Physics, Aristotle said that a thing's nature is its internal principle of change and stability, and what is natural to the thing is to follow this internal principle. Although most acorns will not become oak trees, becoming an oak tree is natural to an acorn in this sense. In claiming on behalf of Thrasymachus that justice is not natural but a matter of convention, Glaucon is suggesting that injustice is what comes naturally to us. Left to our own devices, we strive to outdo our fellows without regard to the propriety of doing so. But since we weak folks fear being treated unjustly, we band together and take power, inventing the rules of justice to protect ourselves against the more powerful, who are fewer and can be subjugated by the many. Thus justice is conventional, not natural. It is an invention, imposed upon us from without, existing only as the result of intentional human activity and choice. The basic picture will be familiar to readers acquainted with the great 17th-century British philosopher, Thomas Hobbes. Imagine a world before law and civilization. In this state of nature, Hobbes thought, we have complete freedom to do whatever we want to do. There are no moral or legal restrictions on one's conduct. The good news, then, is that you can do whatever you want to do, take someone else's stuff, kill them if you feel so inclined, etc. The bad news, of course, is that everyone else can do so as well. Life in the state of nature, Hobbes said, is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. There is no right to life in the state of nature, understood as a claim right or entitlement not to be killed, which imposes a duty on others not to kill. But most of us, Hobbes plausibly thought, are willing to give up some of the total freedom we have in the state of nature in exchange for the sort of security a right to life brings. I agree not to kill you and take your stuff, but only on the condition that you agree to do the same for me. Thus is civil society, and indeed morality, born. Justice, on this view, is the result of a bargain. It is an invention, and thus conventional rather than natural. Only a fool, Thrasymachus and Hobbes think, would altruistically refrain from killing and taking from others, without getting a corresponding guarantee in return. Most of us find it to our advantage to come to an agreement with each other neither to do injustice nor to suffer it, and thus we make laws and covenants, and what the law commands, we call just and lawful. Hobbes takes an additional step not mentioned by Thrasymachus or Glaucon, holding that there must be an authority to settle disputes and enforce the social contract, but we need not linger over this point. On this Thrasymachus view, justice is not natural in either sense distinguished above. Far from being mind or culture independent, it is something we invent rather than discover, and there is nothing more to it than the rules agreed to. Thrasymachus expressed such a view in premise 2 of the error argument back in Book 1. Moreover, it is injustice, he holds, and not justice, that comes naturally to us. Injustice is what anyone's nature naturally pursues as good, on the Thrasymachus view. The ideal of masculinity implicit in this view of justice will seem to many a toxic one. A true man, Glaucon says, wearing his Thrasymachus mask, would not make an agreement with anyone not to do injustice in order not to suffer it. He would not make such an agreement because he would not have to. The Thrasymachus man is able to impose his will on his fellows in the state of nature. He has no need of rules restraining his natural inclinations to outdo others, since he is powerful enough not to fall victim to others' attempts to outdo him. Later in the Republic, Plato will criticize this picture of masculinity, but for now it is part of the Thrasymachus picture Glaucon is painting. Even though most of us lack this kind of strength and power, if enough of us band together we might be more powerful than the Thrasymachus true man. If so, we can make rules to protect ourselves against him, since morality or, rather, morality is merely the mechanism by which the powerful protect their interests. But if this group of individually weak but collectively strong people is driven by self-interest, it is unlikely to extend the protections of morality to those whom it can exploit for its own ends. This brings us to the second thesis. Thrasymachus thesis number 2. Those who act justly do so unwillingly. The second thesis is intimately connected with the first. Since injustice comes naturally to us and justice is unnatural and artificial, acting justly is contrary to our natural inclinations, it goes against our grain because the desire to outdo others and get more and more is what anyone's nature naturally pursues as good. On this view, people who act justly do so unwillingly. If they could get away with acting unjustly, they would. And in fact, the artifice of justice does not merely go against our nature, it distorts it. Nature is forced by law into the perversion of treating fairness with respect. This is a pretty bleak view of human nature and of the nature of morality, but it has an undeniable plausibility. But Glaucon does not rely merely on forceful language to garner agreement. He gives a famous argument for it, the ring of Gyges argument, important both for its content but also for the kind of argument it is. The ring in question belongs not to Gyges, but to an ancestor of his, so the argument is misnamed, but that does not really matter to the point at hand, which is Thrasymachon thesis number 2. Gyges' ancestor happens upon a ring with magical powers. When he turns it in a certain direction, he becomes invisible. What does he do with his newfound power of invisibility? He seduces the queen, kills the king, and takes over the kingdom. The key move in the argument happens next. Imagine, says Glaucon, that there is another such ring. What do you think its wearer would do? Would they be so thoroughly, incorruptibly moral that they would not take advantage of the situation to enrich themselves at the expense of others? If you think the wearer would act unjustly because they can do so with impunity, you should agree that the second thesis is true. We act justly only because we think we have to, Thrasymachus thinks, not because we want to. If we could act immorally and get away with it, we would do just what Gyges' ancestor did. Glaucon has offered a thought experiment, which is a very common way of doing philosophy. Here is a fanciful scenario. What do you think about it? What is the right thing to do? Philosophical inquiry is rife with thought experiments. Would you throw the switch to divert a runaway trolley car from a track on which it will kill 5 workers to a track on which it will kill only 1? If you were kidnapped by the Society of Music Lovers and awoke with your kidneys connected to those of a famous violinist who will die if you disconnect yourself, are you morally permitted to disconnect yourself, resulting in the violinist's death? Etc. There is certainly a place for thought experiments in philosophical thinking, and their artificiality is no objection to them. They are not intended as realistic situations we encounter in our everyday lives, but rather bear certain similarities to situations we do encounter in ordinary life. If you think disconnecting yourself from the violinist is permissible, should not you also think that it is permissible for a woman to terminate an involuntary pregnancy? Thought experiments are common in philosophy and in theoretical physics, too. Just ask Schrödinger's cat. But when fundamental claims about human nature are at issue, perhaps thought experiments should yield to fields like evolutionary biology and psychology. That the Thrasymachon takes it to be obvious that most people think they would act as Gyges did if they had the chance might tell us a lot about the culture these Thrasymachons inhabit, even if it does not establish any transcultural truths about human nature. But that is probably all it is intended to do here. Thrasymachon thesis number 2 articulates a widely held view of human nature, one that Glaucon thinks is false, and that he wants Socrates to refute. Thrasymachon thesis number 3. The unjust person is happier than the just person. This, of course, is Thrasymachus' answer to the second of the Republic's 2 main questions, whether the just or unjust life is happier, which Socrates realized that he tried to answer before answering the first one. What is most relevant here are the constraints Glaucon proposes for answering it. If the unjust person is really going to outdo everyone, they will find that having a reputation for justice will greatly help them use the rules of justice to exploit others. They will find that they are more effective at being unjust if they seem just. No one who thought that Bernard Madoff was a conman running a Ponzi scheme would have invested with him. His cheating his investors out of billions of dollars was made possible in no small part by his sterling reputation. The last third or so of the Republic is devoted to assessing this third Thrasymachon thesis. Glaucon is here stating it, not arguing for or against it, though we do know that he actually thinks it is false, devil's advocacy aside. Instead, he is setting the parameters for how Socrates is to defeat this thesis. Harking back to the distinction between kinds of goods, Socrates and company think that most people regard justice as onerous but beneficial, bad intrinsically but good instrumentally, especially the reputation for justice. Glaucon and Socrates think justice is both intrinsically and instrumentally good, but since even skeptics agree with them about its instrumental value, what Socrates needs to do is to show that justice is intrinsically good, that all by itself, a morally good life benefits the person living it, and indeed is better for them than a morally bad life, even if they do not get any of the extrinsic, instrumental benefits. We need to bracket off the instrumental benefits of having a reputation for justice, because if we do not find a way to ignore them, we cannot be sure that we are valuing justice intrinsically, in and of itself, and not for the instrumental benefits a reputation for justice brings. We must take away his reputation, for a reputation for justice would bring him honor and rewards, so it would not be clear whether he is just for the sake of justice itself or for the sake of those honors and rewards. We must strip him of everything except justice and make his situation the opposite of an unjust person's. Though he does no injustice, he must have the greatest reputation for it, so that his justice may be tested full strength and not diluted. So in settling the question of which life is happier, we must draw not only on the distinction between intrinsic and instrumental value but also on the distinction between appearance and reality. Glaucon will regard his belief that the just life is happier as justified only if Socrates can show him that the person who really is just but seems unjust is happier than the person who is unjust but seems just. It is quite a tall order, as Socrates recognizes, but it is the only way they can think of to separate off the intrinsic goodness of justice from its instrumental, reputational benefits. If Socrates can show us that the really just but apparently unjust person is happier than the really unjust but apparently just person, he will have shown us that justice is intrinsically good, since he will have shown that being just in and of itself makes one better off. If he can do this, he will have justified Glaucon's presumably true belief that the just life is happier and thereby transmute his belief into knowledge. Adeimantus UPS the Anti. Glaucon's brother Adeimantus thinks that Glaucon has left out the most important thing, which he takes to be the way justice is treated in Athenian popular culture. Adeimantus' attention to culture shapes the Republic by anchoring Socrates' focus on education in the ideal city that they will soon start constructing, if only in theory. His complaint is that Athenian culture and Greek culture more broadly don't praise justice in itself, but only the high reputations it leads to and the consequences of being thought to be just. He worries about the effect of such a culture on the souls of young people when they see through their culture's shallow platitudes to the deeper anti-realist view that injustice is shameful only in opinion and law and not in itself. Agreeing with Thrasymachus about the value of being unjust but recognizing the importance of seeming just, they will become cynical and hypocritical, desiring to cultivate only a facade of illusory virtue rather than a genuinely virtuous character. The stories Athenian culture tells about the gods, such as the ones we find in Homer's Iliad or Odyssey or Hesiod's Theogony, suggest that the gods can be influenced by prayers, sacrifices, and offerings. It is more profitable, on the Thrasymachus view of individual happiness, to reap the benefits of acting unjustly, and then toward the end of one's life to seek absolution by building a temple or making many sacrifices, thus avoiding the just deserts of a life of injustice. Although there will be a few people of godlike character who are disgusted by injustice, most of us will find the allure of material success too attractive to resist. Some of us will feel guilty or ashamed, but others perhaps because we will feel guilty or ashamed will laugh aloud when we hear justice praised, since, like Thrasymachus, we think justice is for suckers. Thus it is vital, Adeimantus thinks, for Socrates to show that justice is intrinsically good and to ignore any benefits that might accrue to someone with a reputation for justice. He wants Socrates to swim against the tide of Athenian culture and show them that injustice is the worst thing a soul can have in it and that justice is the greatest good. Only if Socrates does this will Glaucon and Adeimantus be justified in their belief that the just life is happier, only then will that belief become knowledge. Socrates' plan. Investigate personal justice by investigating political justice. Socrates' way of responding to Glaucon and Adeimantus' request for a fresh defense of the just life will resonate with anyone who needs drugstore reading glasses to deal with a restaurant menu. Just as it is easier to read larger than smaller letters, Socrates argues, it will be easier to figure out the nature and value of justice if we see it on a larger scale. So the plan is to examine the nature and value of justice writ large, in a polis, city-state. In order to see what it tells us about justice in a person, let us first find out what sort of thing justice is in a city and afterwards look for it in the individual. This method of investigation is apt to strike many readers as odd, since it assumes an analogy between persons and cities that will seem a stretch to many. The analogy has certainly intrigued philosophical commentators on the Republic. Socrates is assuming that justice in individuals and justice in city-states do not differ in any relevant ways. A person, more properly, their soul, and a polis differ in size, and thus so too does the amount of justice each contains, but the amount of justice is not relevant to its nature, Socrates assumes, any more than a glass of water differs in nature from a gallon of water. Water is water, regardless of how much of it there is. As we move forward, we will want to keep in mind the big if at the heart of Socrates' method. If people and city-states are relevantly similar, then what we learn about the nature of justice in the latter can be mapped onto the former. We will see in Book 4 that Socrates will try to do more than just assume they are similar, he will argue that they are. But for now, let us grant the analogy and see what Socrates does with it. A false start. Socrates' rustic utopia. Socrates plans to create a city in theory from its beginnings, but of course it cannot be just any city. For the plan of the Republic to work, it must be a just city. And this city must not only be just, if they are to determine the truth about the nature and value of justice, it must also seem just to Glaucon and company, if they are to be persuaded that the just life is the happier life. Once all agree that the theoretically constructed city is just, the task will be to determine the nature of the virtue of justice, or what makes it just. We should note too that since Plato wants his readers to imaginatively participate in the dialogue, readers will have to determine for themselves whether they find the city Socrates has created to be just, which, remember, is synonymous with being morally good, generally. Readers who do not think the ideal city is just or who are not sure can still follow the argument in a hypothetical way. Well, if this were a just city, does Socrates plausibly explain what makes it just? But this will be less than fully satisfying, especially if, like Glaucon and Adeimantus, we want Socrates to provide us with reasons we find plausible that would justify the belief, if indeed we hold it, that the just life is a better and happier life than the unjust life. The origin of any community, Socrates thinks, is that none of us is self-sufficient. It is not just that we have needs, but we have needs that we cannot ourselves always meet. Thus, he thinks, communities are formed, people gather in a single place to live together as partners and helpers. This idea of cities as essentially cooperative is an attractive one, and it is at odds with the Thrasymachus view of cities as sites of competition rather than cooperation, where citizens are always trying to outdo each other. Perhaps Thrasymachus could agree with Socrates about the cooperative origins of any polis, while thinking that people will strive to outdo each other once a city is up and running. People will always strive to exploit others' neediness for their own advantage, and crafty Thrasymachans will be more successful at doing so than others. Socrates next argues for a division of labor principle that will not only organize the city's economic life but will ultimately have profound ethical implications, as it will be the basis of the definition of justice he arrives at in Book 4. We are all born with different natural aptitudes and preferences, he thinks, each of us having a distinctive rogam omicron nu, ergon, or natural task or function, a notion we met in Book 1, most notably in the function argument. Since we are born with different aptitudes, Socrates advocates a division of labor. More plentiful and better quality goods are more easily produced if each person does one thing for which he is naturally suited, and is released from having to do any of the others. At least two things about the argument for what we will call the specialization principle are worth attending to. The first is the way Socrates appeals to what he takes to be natural facts in arguing for it, facts which many readers will find quite plausible. Many readers will have known people who have always been good at math, or who can quickly master a variety of musical instruments, or who have a knack with machines, or who excel at certain sports, etc. Though hard work and discipline are necessary for success in such areas, there usually is a natural aptitude at the core that can be developed and perhaps perfected by diligent practice and education, but without the natural aptitude as the raw material which nurture can develop, the chances of high-level success seem slim indeed. The second feature is that Socrates advocates the specialization principle because it benefits the community as a whole, not because it enables individual flourishing. This is perhaps the first inkling of Socrates' communitarian inclinations. He is likelier to think of the needs and good of the community first, in relatively sharp contrast to the tendency many contemporary Westerners, especially Americans, have to think individualistically. On this individualistic view, individuals are morally primary and communities exist primarily to enable individual flourishing or perhaps to protect the natural rights individuals possess. the distinction between communitarian and individualistic thinking is a matter of degree and often context. A baseball team or string quartet comprising dyed-in-the-wool individualists who care more, or only, about their own individual successes will surely be less successful than teams or quartets with more group-minded members. In the riveting opening chapter of his novel, Enduring Love, Ian McEwan writes of morality's ancient, irresolvable dilemma, us or me. If McEwan is right, the fundamental moral question is not us versus them or me versus you, but rather me versus we. Do the needs and interests of the community trump the individuals? Far from regarding the dilemma as irresolvable, Plato and Socrates resolve it in favor of we over me. I suspect that many, if not most, readers will often find themselves resistant to and put off by Socrates' communitarian, we-favoring impulses. Even so, there is much value in being confronted with thinking that is fundamentally different from one's own, as this not only provides alternative perspectives but also might force one to play Glaucon and Adiamantus and try to justify deeply held beliefs that one takes for granted. There will be many occupations in the ideal city: farmers, builders, carpenters, shepherds, weavers, and cobblers, to name a few. There will also be importers and exporters, merchants, retailers, and physical laborers. Very quickly, in just a couple of pages, we learn that the ideal city is complete. Our city has grown to completeness. So, where are justice and injustice to be found in it? As Socrates begins to answer this question by examining the sort of lives its citizens lead, Glaucon objects to the surprise of many readers to the food. The food is of the sort they cook in the country, he complains, unsuitable for a young Athenian aristocrat, but perhaps suitable if you were founding a city for pigs. Most readers are apt to be misled by this charge, since to modern ears talk of pigs suggests gluttony and perhaps uncleanliness. But this is not the connotation for ancient Athenians, for whom, Miles Bunyatt points out, the pig was an emblem rather of ignorance. Any pig would know was the saying. What Glaucon means is, you describe the feasting of people who do not know how to live. It is uncivilized. 5 Socrates acquiesces and agrees to develop a luxurious city better suited to his young friend's expectations about what a good life involves. He does not agree with them, as he quickly makes clear, the true city, is the one we have described, the healthy one. But he goes along with them because the plan of the Republic demands it. Glaucon and Adiamantus, remember, want Socrates to provide them with good reasons for a belief they sincerely hold but recognize to be unjustified, the belief that the just life is the happier one. If this requires that they give up their conception of what a good life is, if justice requires that they live the simple, rustic life Socrates depicts, they are unlikely to be convinced by what he has to say. There is some interesting scholarly disagreement about whether and how seriously to take Socrates' praise of the first city. Its benign anarchy, there is no mention of any political structures or governmental offices, will appeal to many readers, as will its simplicity, its communal bonds, and its relative self-sustainability. But the ideal city they ultimately develop is structured by 3 natural classes, which suggests that the first city, which lacks them, is not natural after all. In any event, Socrates agrees to sketch a luxurious city, replete with the sorts of delicacies Glaucon and Adiamantus insist upon and, going well beyond the more basic necessities found in the first city, to include perfumes, prostitutes, and pastries. More striking, though, than what the luxurious city includes is what follows in its wake: war. Having overstepped the limit of their necessities, the citizens now require resources they do not possess, and now possess goods that other city-states might envy and seek for themselves. It is striking that Plato finds the origins of war not in an innately aggressive human nature. The explanation is social and economic rather than biological. Communities come into conflict with each other when they exceed a simple, natural life and grasp for luxury, and here pleonexia rears its ugly, Thrasymachon head. If the first, rustic city is a real possibility, then acquisitive, me-first pleonexia is not what comes naturally to human beings. Obviously, with warfare comes the need for soldiers, but Socrates eschews the idea of citizen soldiers in favor of a professional army. Warfare is a profession, he argues, and according to the specialization principle, only someone with a natural aptitude for warfare should become a soldier. But the ideal soldier must naturally be both gentle and high-spirited, tough with foes, but gentle with friends. Socrates initially despairs of finding such a combination, worrying that these traits are so at odds with each other that it seems impossible to combine them and thus that a good guardian cannot exist. His despair vanishes, though, when he thinks of dogs, whom he delightfully regards as truly philosophical, since their conduct is knowledge-based. Dogs treat people differently based on whether they know the person or not. Friends are proper objects of gentleness, while strangers or foes are not. Of course, not all dogs make good watchdogs. Some are too gentle and sweet by nature, others too aggressive, even with family members. Since gentleness and high-spiritedness are often at odds with each other, proper education will be crucial to the soldier guardian's proper development and thus to the flourishing of the city. So once we have found someone who seems to possess a natural aptitude for guarding the city, in the case of soldiers, or the home, in the case of dogs, the question is this: how are we to bring him up and educate him? This is the question to which we turn in the following chapter. Chapter 4. Blueprints for a Platonic Utopia. In having Socrates work out the proper education for the would-be guardians, which at least initially must include all the city's children, Plato engages in the philosophy of education for the first time in the Western philosophical tradition. He is not the first philosopher to do so, as readers familiar with non-Western philosophy will know. Confucius' Analects, which predates Plato's Republic by almost a century, devotes considerable attention to the nature and value of education and in fact begins by celebrating it. Indeed, the first word, the master, is quoted as saying ishwa, which means learning or study. Education is a topic of sustained focus in the Republic. In Books 2 and 3, Plato sees education as a two-pronged endeavor, comprising physical training for bodies and music and poetry for the soul. A little later, he will reconsider this way of thinking about education's objects, holding that physical training and poetic education are both chiefly for the sake of the soul. Later in the Republic, while developing the famous allegory of the cave in Book 7, Plato has Socrates give an account of formal education involving arithmetic, geometry, astronomy or physics, and dialectic, a sort of philosophical logic, more or less inventing what has come to be known as liberal education. In Books 2 and 3, however, the focus is on education's less formal aspects, education in the wider sense of the Greek word pi alpha iota delta epsilon alpha, paideia, upbringing or enculturation. Supervising the storytellers. Musical and poetic content. Socrates is especially concerned with the effects of popular culture on the development of character, both of the would-be soldier guardians and of the citizenry at large. We begin absorbing our culture, which is carried by the songs sung in the home and in public, so Socrates first focuses on the stories, literally the myths, mutheidomicroniota, mythoi, children hear in the songs sung to and around them. Many readers will shrink at Socrates insisting that the first thing he and his fellow theoretical architects must do is supervise the storytellers. But even those of us who value freedom of speech and artistic expression, two values conspicuous by their absence in the Republic, probably do not think that all books or movies or television shows or video games or music are appropriate at all ages. But while most readers will likely think this is a private matter, to be determined by parents, for Plato it is too important to be left to individual discretion, and thus is another of those places where his community-mindedness is evident. After all, the explicit point of education is to develop good soldier guardians, which is surely a matter of public and not merely private concern. At the root of Plato's educational program is a belief in the malleability of the human psyche, especially at young ages. You know, don't you, that the beginning of any process is most important, especially for anything young and tender? It's at that time that it is most malleable and takes on any pattern one wishes to impress upon it. Hence the need to regulate the stories children hear, both their content and their form. Socrates focuses first on the former, on what the stories say, and then in Book 3 he focuses on how the stories are told, on their form. The most important restriction on the content of stories is that they must not convey true falsehoods, which are falsehoods, about the most important things. The phrase true falsehood is easy to trip over, since it suggests the idea of stories that are literally false, but convey moral truths. This is emphatically not what Socrates means. True here means real or genuine. A true falsehood is something that is deeply, genuinely false. Socrates is not anti-fiction. He is not opposed to nursery rhymes that contain literal falsehoods, or what he calls falsehood in words. That there never was a person who lived in a shoe or a race between a tortoise and a hare is not important, so long as the story's underlying moral message is not radically false. There are three categories of stories whose content should be regulated: stories about the gods, stories about epic heroes, and stories about people. Socrates rightly avoids regulating the last kind of story at this stage of the Republic. Presumably, he regards Thrasymachus' claim that the unjust life is happier than a just life as a true falsehood. It is deeply, profoundly mistaken and soul-distorting, and it ruins anyone who steers their life by it. But to rule out such stories now, before the Republic's two questions have been satisfactorily answered, would beg the question that is, it would assume the truth of what he should be trying to prove. It would be intellectually unfair to adopt a regulation banning such stories in his ideal city, since he is not yet entitled to claim that Thrasymachus is mistaken. As the gods are among the most important things, we must be on guard against true falsehoods regarding the gods. There are two restrictions on stories about the gods. First, that the gods are not the cause of everything but only of good things. Second, that the gods are not shapeshifters or deceivers who mislead us by falsehoods in words or deeds. Since a god is by nature good, and what is good cannot cause something harmful and bad, a god cannot be the cause of bad things. So any story saying otherwise is promoting a true falsehood and should be disallowed, even if Homer or Hesiod or any canonical Greek poet is its author. The same goes for stories depicting gods as deceivers. Since the best things are least liable to change and the gods are among the best things, they would not alter their appearances or have any need to speak falsely. We might question the chains of argument by which Socrates arrives at these conclusions. For example, he never considers the possibility that there are no gods, or the possibility that a god might lie for good reasons. But the real takeaways here are not the particular content of any rules he arrives at, but rather three key ideas. First, that one should not uncritically accept the norms and values of one's culture. Second, that reason provides a perspective from which cultural norms and values can be assessed. And third, that if there is a conflict between culture or tradition and reason, we should follow the dictates of reason. Although his community-first ethos is often associated with a kind of conservatism that prizes tradition and the wisdom embodied therein, Socrates is no conservative. Far from it. He is a radical rationalist, believing that rationality affords a perspective from which a tradition's practices and values can be assessed. Socrates loves Homer, but he thinks that his passion for poetry must give way to what reason tells him about it. Hence he goes through Homer and Hesiod with an editor's pen, striking passages that cannot stand up to rational scrutiny, much as someone might go through the Bible or Quran striking out passages they took to express true falsehoods. Thomas Jefferson seems to have been up to something similar in the life and morals of Jesus of Nazareth, in which he excised all mention of Jesus' divinity, his performing miracles, resurrection, etc. Much as censoring stories about the gods is designed to foster the virtue of piety, censoring stories about epic heroes is meant to foster the secular virtues of courage and moderation. If would-be guardians are to acquire the courage-grounding belief that there are things that are worse than death, slavery, and dishonor, to name two, they must not be exposed to stories about the horrors of Hades or of heroes lamenting the loss of loved ones. The same goes for moderation, also known as temperance. If young people are to become temperate, they must have exemplars to imitate, which they will not have if they are exposed to stories showing heroes overindulging in food, drink, and sex, or desiring money or acting arrogantly or being overcome by anger or even laughter. Socrates' point here is that one's culture provides models of appropriate behavior, models that we internalize from a very young age. Although the reasoning is not conscious, the process seems to go something like this. We hear stories of gods acting dishonestly or heroes wailing about death and infer that these are appropriate ways for us to behave. Everyone will be ready to excuse himself when he is bad, Socrates argues, if he is persuaded that similar things have been done in the past by close descendants of the gods. Hence, it is vitally important that one be exposed to good models right from the start, where good models does a double duty, good models of good people. That Athenian culture fails in this regard, that its stories traffic in models of clever people acting unjustly and getting away with it, is Adeimantus' complaint. supervising the storyteller's musical and poetic style. One of the fascinating features of Socrates' account of education broadly construed is that it attends not merely to the content of stories and songs, as we might expect, but to their form or style, as well. The main idea is that a song's musical mode not exactly equivalent to our notion of key but close enough for our purposes and its meter or rhythm affect us independently of its words. This issue is connected to a long-standing debate in the philosophy of music about whether music contains emotions or merely excites them, whether, for example, the second movement of Schubert's Sonata in A major is sad in itself, or whether the sadness is merely evoked in us by the music, which is itself emotionally unladen. How music could encode emotions is a fascinating question, but it is one we need not address here, since what Plato has Socrates say does not require, though it is consistent with the view that music contains and encodes emotion rather than merely evoking it in listeners. While Greek musical modes are not identical to keys in Western music, thinking about keys can help us get a sense of how different modes have different emotional tones. The internet can be a great help here, since YouTube is rife with songs in which the key has been shifted from major to minor or minor to major. Consider the Beatles' classic, Hey Jude, originally written in F major. Transposed to F minor, it is a very different song, sad, pensive, almost dour. Upbeat pop songs like Cyndi Lauper's Girls Just Want to Have Fun or Cheap Trick's I Want You to Want Me sound sad and ironic when transposed from their original major to the corresponding minor key. Regardless of whether one stands or kneels for the Star-Spangled Banner before a professional football game, it seems like a different song when sung in a minor key. It works the other way, too. REM's Losing My Religion sounds happy and optimistic when modulated into a major, as does the theme from The Godfather. The lesson here is that the key or, for Plato, mode in which a song is sung matters. So in addition to wanting to delete the lamentations and pitiful speeches of famous men, since they cultivate cowardice and indulgence rather than courage and temperance, Socrates also wants to do away with the lamenting modes in his ideal city, since even without lamenting lyrics, these modes will convey or cultivate these vices, too. The soft modes suitable for drinking parties are out, too. What remains are the mode that would suitably imitate the tone and rhythm of a courageous person who is active in battle, and another mode, that of someone engaged in a peaceful, unforced voluntary action, acting with moderation and self-control, since these modes will cultivate the emotions and thus virtues proper to the would-be guardians. Socrates pays similar attention to rhythm and meter, aiming to cultivate grace and avoid gracelessness. It is important to see that the restrictions on form and style are not afterthoughts, secondary to the restrictions on content. They are in fact more basic, since we are exposed to music well before we can understand the words of the songs our families and fellow citizens sing to and around us. Rhythm and harmony, Socrates says, permeate the inner part of the soul more than anything else. Before we can understand the words of songs, we are shaped by their modes and rhythms, and indeed the shaping done by rhythm and harmony is even more important, Socrates thinks, since it begins to work on us at once. The point of proper aesthetic education here is not to come to have knowledge about the beautiful, but rather to come to know it directly, to recognize it when we hear and later see it. The aesthetically beautiful and the morally beautiful. At least 3 other features of Plato's account of aesthetic development are worthy of our attention. The first is that our aesthetic education is in fact the beginning of our moral education. Plato does not draw a sharp line, as we moderns tend to, between the beautiful and the morally good. While other approaches to ethics focus on duty and action, for example, the ethics embodied in the Ten Commandments, replete as it is with shalts and shalt nots, and in the modern era Kant's duty-based deontology, Plato's ethics takes virtue to be central. For a virtue-centered ethics, the fundamental question is not what should I do, but what kind of person should I be? Where duty is essentially imperative, placing demands upon us, virtue is essentially attractive, expressing ideals of character that we can approach by degrees and, if Plato is right, that we are drawn to precisely because it is beautiful, kapilandomikron nu, kalin. Where Kant thought one should be motivated by duty to do one's duty, Plato, and here I am making the safe bet that he would agree with his student Aristotle, who is much more explicit about this than his teacher, holds that the proper moral motivation for performing a certain action is that the action is fine or noble or beautiful, that it is kalin, which seamlessly combines aesthetic and moral notions. Our moral education begins with our aesthetic education because, Plato thinks, proper exposure to beautiful modes, harmonies, and rhythms will cultivate the right distastes and tastes in young people. This is not so they will become cultured aesthetes devoted to the aesthetically beautiful, but rather so they will be able to recognize and become devoted to the morally beautiful. In learning to recognize ugly sounds as ugly, we come to learn to recognize shameful actions as shameful. It is no accident that the same Greek word alpha sigma kairo, iskros, means both ugly and shameful. Socrates regards doing injustice as shameful, but the Thrasymachon strong men and anyone whose moral sensibilities have not been properly cultivated has no scruples about doing injustice, since he does not find the very idea repellent. Without radically altering the kind of upbringing and education Athenian popular culture will produce, young people will not be disgusted by injustice but will try to get away with it when they can. A second important feature is that proper musical education will inculcate correct moral beliefs while we are still young and unable to grasp the reason. In other words, we will learn that certain traits and actions are admirable while others are not, but this will not teach us why the morally admirable traits are admirable. For that, we need philosophy. As I have noted already, this is essentially Glaucon's and Adeimantus' position. They believe that justice trumps convenience and self-interest, that the just life is happier than the unjust life, etc., but they recognize that they cannot justify these beliefs. But this underlying moral substrate of proper tastes and distastes, in a word, proper moral sentiments or feelings, is absolutely essential, on Socrates' view. Children who develop in a musically corrupt culture will fail to acquire the correct moral beliefs because of the false models of beauty they will internalize. A third feature, closely related to the second, is that properly educated children will love what is beautiful and good. Education in music and poetry, says Socrates, ought to end in the love of the fine and beautiful, kappa alpha lambda omicron rho omega tau iota kappa, kalu erosha. It is well worth noting that the love there is erotic love. They are in love with what is noble and fine, with what is morally beautiful. So, underlying any cognitive, philosophical grasp of justice is a pre-rational, emotional attachment to it. This comes to the fore later in Book 3 when Socrates, in addressing the question of who should rule, separates off the guardians from the auxiliaries. We will say more about this in a bit, but it is worth bringing out the connection between love and governing. The rulers must be the best of the guardians, Socrates thinks. But in the Book 1 conversation with Polemarchus, he said that the best guardian of something is also its best thief. What keeps these guardian rulers from stealing the city from going Thrasymachon, so to speak, and using their power to benefit themselves is that they love the city? The right kind of love, the orthos eros, that is the product of proper musical education, is the love of order and beauty. In loving the city, the guardians identify its good with theirs. Someone loves something most of all when he believes that the same things are advantageous to it as to himself and supposes that if it does well, he will do well, and that if it does badly, then he will do badly too. Love certainly has an affective or phenomenological dimension. It feels a certain way. The variety of poems and pop songs devoted to what love feels like attests to the difficulty of describing the feeling in a non-metaphorical way. Love is like a heat wave, love is a flame, etc. But in stressing the belief at the core of love, Plato plays down its affective dimension and plays up its cognitive dimension. We should note an asymmetry to the belief at the heart of Socratic love. In loving you, I identify my well-being with yours. I take what is good for you to be good for me. Taking what is good for me to be good for you is another way of creating an identity between your well-being and mine, but it is a defective form of love if it is a form of love at all. Many readers know, sadly, some know through first-hand experience, parents who force or at least voice their well-being and conceptions of what a good life is onto their children, insisting that the child act for the sake of the parent. In addition to this asymmetry in belief, we should note that love requires something more than this belief and a feeling of fondness. In addition to love's cognitive and affective dimensions, there is also what we might call, for lack of a better word, its conative dimension, for loving another involves commitment to the other's well-being and thus taking actions to promote it, often actions that seem to go against the lover's interests. If I merely believe that your good is thereby also my good, but I do nothing to promote your good when I am able to do so, it is hard to take seriously my claim that I love you. The upshot and real point of proper musical education, then, is that the guardians love the city. Wherefore Thrasymachus, there is a clear gap between what is good for me as a ruler and what is good for the city. Socratic love for the city closes this gap. That a certain course of action might benefit me as a ruler at the expense of the city gets no traction if I have been properly educated. There just is not any space for such considerations to have any pull. The properly educated ruler would be baffled at the thought that they could gain from selling out the city, since the city's good is their good, just as no amount of money would induce a good parent to sell their child into sex slavery. As we will see momentarily, the city's founders must find ways to test the would-be guardians to discover which of them cannot be induced to give up their love of the city. They must make sure that neither compulsion nor magic spells will get them to discard or forget their belief that they must do what is best for the city. Physical education and food. Plato says significantly less about physical education, the other prong of the would-be guardian's education. Given that the Greek word here is gamma upsilon mu alpha sigma tau iota kappa, gymnastik, from which we get the English word gymnastics, we might expect a discussion of various kinds of exercises, but detailed supervision of the body is not really necessary. Socrates thinks, as a well-cared-for soul will be able to figure out what is appropriate for the body. He will return to the topic of physical education, especially as it concerns soldiering, in Book 5. But here Socrates does offer a bit detail where food is concerned, with examples drawn from Homer. The soldier guardians will eat roasted but not boiled meats, presumably because this requires less equipment to be lugged around. There will be no fish, which as we noted above is a luxury item, no sweet desserts, and no Syracusan or Sicilian delicacies, Siomicron nu, opsin, though this time Glaucon raises no objection. The guardian's lifestyle should be simple, both musically and physically. Simple music conduces to personal in the soul, and simple food conduces to bodily health. Symptoms of poorly educated cities: too many lawyers and doctors. Given how frequently one hears jokes about lawyers and complaints that American society is overly litigious, Google's fascinating Ngram viewer shows a twofold increase in the use of the word litigious in American English in the last half of the 20th century. It is likely that many readers will agree with Socrates that an overabundance of lawyers is a symptom of something amiss, bemoaning those who take pride in being clever at, exploiting every loophole and trick to ensure that their clients escape conviction. Fewer, I suspect, are likely to bemoan the presence of doctors, as Socrates does. At least as regards illness resulting from idleness and dubious dietary choices, we may concede that he has a point. But many readers will find what Socrates says about disease and disability shocking and indeed morally abhorrent. His remarks about those who are chronically, incurably ill are apt to make one shudder. As for the ones whose bodies are naturally unhealthy or whose souls are incurably evil, let the former die of their own accord and put the latter to death. One reason Socrates' attitude can seem horrifyingly wrong-headed is that it seems driven by the specialization principle and his community-mindedness. Everyone in a well-regulated city has his own work to do, and no one has the leisure to be ill and under treatment all his life. Since the chronically ill cannot contribute to the city, the argument seems to go, caring for them would just be a drain on resources. Many readers will insist that individuals have a value that transcends their usefulness or instrumental worth, and that treating them as dispensable cogs in a great machine is profoundly immoral, as it fails to recognize and respect their inherent dignity. Here we seem to find the starkest of clashes between individualism and communitarianism. Without seeking to defend Socrates' attitude, it is worth noting that this is only half the story, for he also appeals to the perspective of the diseased individual. Such a person would be of no profit either to himself or to the city. His life is of no profit to him if he does not do his work. While this might blunt the sharp edges of Socrates' view, it does so in a way that many people, informed by contemporary thinking on disability or by their own life experiences, will find offensive and profoundly mistaken. For it seems to take as its guide not the perspective of those who are chronically ill or disabled, but rather the perspective of healthy people imagining how they would react to permanent disability. Empirical research suggests that the perhaps commonsensical assumption that disabilities make the lives of the disabled significantly, if not disastrously worse, is mistaken, and many readers will themselves have lives well worth living or will have friends and family members whose lives are well worth living despite their physical and cognitive limitations. We might share some of Socrates' wariness about excessive care and attention to the body, being aware, as he is not, of the corrosive dangers of cultural norms of physical perfection, without sharing his attitude toward the disabled. And many will regard Socrates' attitude as not only morally abhorrent, but philosophically suspect, as well. On the medical model of disability, a disability is thought of as an abnormality, such as an inability to walk that in itself significantly impairs its possessor's chances for a happy, flourishing life. But the social model of disability, which is now the standard view in the field of disability studies, challenges the medical model. It distinguishes impairments from disabilities, regarding the inability to walk, for example, as atypical rather than abnormal. It is an impairment, but it is a disability only in a society that is inhospitable to and stigmatizes those who cannot walk. On the social model, being disabled is largely a social fact, turning on the ways in which a society is structured with respect to various impairments. While it might seem obvious that deafness, for example, is a disability, many regard it instead as a difference and treasure it as part of their identity. This brief discussion is not meant to suggest that the social model is correct, but rather that thinking about disability has advanced significantly since Socrates' time, and the medical model he assumes to be obviously correct has been called into serious doubt in recent decades. Harmony between musical and physical education. As we noted above, Socrates initially said that musical education treats the soul while physical education treats the body, but towards the end of Book 3 he corrects himself, holding that both are chiefly for the sake of the soul. And here he hints at the distinction he will make in Book 4 between the parts of the soul, suggesting that physical training aims at properly arousing the spirited part of one's nature while musical education tends the philosophical part. His overriding concern is that the two parts be brought into harmony or balance. Remember that guardians must be both gentle and high-spirited, traits that are typically not found together and that are in tension when they are. Too much gymnastique and one ends up savage and harsh rather than spirited, too much musique results in softness rather than gentleness. As noted earlier, the Republic is written in the decades following Athens' defeat by Sparta in the nearly 3 decades-long Peloponnesian War. It is not a stretch to see Plato here trying to find a balance of the best of the Spartan and Athenian temperaments while avoiding their excesses. Towards the end of Book 3, the artistic culture of the ideal city has been morally purified, lest citizens be harmed by being exposed to images of evil, like cows grazing in a meadow of bad grass. The potential guardians are subjected from youth onto a series of tests designed to see whether their belief, that they just do what is best for the city can survive the blandishments of pleasure, the pressures of compulsion, and the effects of time and rhetoric. Here and elsewhere in Book 3 Socrates is concerned with changes that escape notice. A potential guardian who can be persuaded by a sophist, such as Thrasymachus, will not pass muster, since clever rhetoric can take away their opinions without their realizing it. After describing the tests employed, Socrates distinguishes complete guardians from the auxiliaries, resulting in a city with 3 classes: guardians or rulers, auxiliaries, and craftspeople. As will become clear, these are not socioeconomic classes, but rather political classes, distinguished not by wealth, but by political authority. The rulers and their helpers, that is, the guardians and the auxiliaries, live a spare, communal lifestyle, owning no private property, and living together in military-style barracks, as befits warrior athletes. Though it might be tempting to think that those who pass these exacting tests are guardians while those who do not are merely auxiliaries, this clearly will not do. The auxiliaries must also be guardians of this conviction, that they must do what is best for the city. The difference is age and experience. The auxiliaries are young people, while presumably the guardians, like good judges, are older and have more experience. A good judge, Socrates thinks, has learned late in life what injustice is like and who has become aware of it not as something at home in his soul, but as something alien and present in others, someone who, after a long time, has recognized that injustice is bad by nature, not from his own experience of it, but through knowledge. We will soon see that a crucial difference between auxiliaries and guardians is that the auxiliaries have unshakable and true beliefs about what is best for the city. The guardians have something even firmer: they have knowledge of what is best for the city. The noble falsehood. The structure of the ideal city now set, Socrates offers a three-part foundational myth for the ideal city, which he calls the noble falsehood. He imagines telling the first-generation citizens of the now completed city that they are born from the earth, which is their mother. They literally are of the soil of this place. This presumably will make them eager to defend their city-state, as one would be eager to defend one's mother. The second part of the myth follows from the first, since they are born of the same soil, they are all related, all brothers and sisters. Thinking of one's fellow citizens as family, he thinks, will bind the city together as one, making the citizens love each other as family members ideally do. For many of us, family bonds transcend reasons in an interesting and important way. Whether one's siblings merit one's love seems beside the point. The basis of family affection is the bare fact of being related. That someone is your brother or sister itself provides reasons for action. Some philosophers are suspicious of the kind of loyalty that is grounded in pure relations rather than reasons, since it can lead to immoral or illegal actions, as many a Law and Order episode will attest. While we might expect Socrates to explore and question such loyalty, instead he exploits it, finding unifying power in familial love. Readers will remember that among the restrictions on stories about the gods is that no stories about gods hating or fighting each other will be allowed, since we want the guardians of our city to think that it is shameful to be easily provoked into hating one another, which is impious. The last element of the noble falsehood is the famous myth of the metals, the god who made you mix some gold into those who are adequately equipped to rule. He puts silver in those who are auxiliaries and iron and bronze in the farmers and other craftsmen. So each class of the city is distinguished by the kind of metal that dominates the souls of its members. This is one of the most interesting as well as objectionable parts of the Republic. Its interest, I think, is its indicating Plato's awareness of the importance of myth in public life, especially myths of origin. Though humans are rational, we are not entirely rational. Earlier, Socrates appealed to the love the guardians have for the city as the glue binding them to it, although it is a love more cognitive than affective. And we just saw that the primary purpose of the second part of the noble falsehood is to cause the citizens to love each other. In having Socrates offer the noble falsehood, Plato is acknowledging the power and importance of myth, not just to human self-understanding but to the formation of a people of a nation or, here, a city-state. What the myth of the metals does is to provide a narrative understanding and mythic justification of the ideal city's three-part and decidedly non-egalitarian structure. The guardian's most important task, Socrates says, is to guard against the mixture of metals in the souls of the next generation, for the city will be ruined if it ever has an iron or bronze guardian. Oddly, there is no claim that letting the silver-souled auxiliaries rule would have this destructive power. It is clear that Socrates must think of the noble falsehood as a merely verbal falsehood, one of those useful falsehoods mentioned at the end of Book 2, rather than a true or genuine falsehood, which is a falsehood about the most important things. Thrasymachus' belief that the unjust life is the happier life would be a true falsehood, on Socrates' view. It is not a true lie, since lying requires intentional deception, trying to get others to believe what you regard as false, and there is nothing to suggest that Thrasymachus does not sincerely hold the view he espouses. But, on Socrates' view, anyway, it is a true falsehood. It is not just factually false, but morally false and profoundly damaging to someone who believes it, since someone who lives their life by it cannot be happy, a claim he will try to prove in the last third of the Republic. Like the allowable stories about the gods and heroes, the noble falsehood is factually false. The citizens are not in fact born from the soil and are not actually distinguished by the kinds of metals in their souls. But its message, Socrates thinks, is deeply true. This is where the noble falsehood is apt to seem most objectionable, for the profound claim it expresses, cloaked in mythic garb, is that human beings are not created equal. The guardians are simply more valuable than the craftspeople, Socrates holds, in the same way that the sexist thinks that men are just more valuable than women and the racist thinks that white people are just more valuable, possess more intrinsic worth, than non-whites. Anyone who subscribes to the fundamental moral and political equality of human beings will have to regard Socrates' noble falsehood as not merely a verbal falsehood but rather a true falsehood, with profoundly harmful consequences to those who believe it. If it is a compelling myth, a craftsperson will see nothing amiss in not having a voice in how the polis is governed, it is just not their place. Much of the power of myth is ideological, making what is contingent and constructed seem natural and necessary. In a memorable passage from My Bondage and My Freedom, Frederick Douglass recalls having been taught from the pulpit at St. Michael's the duty of obedience to our masters, to recognize God as the author of our enslavement, to regard running away an offense, alike against God and man, to deem our enslavement a merciful and beneficial arrangement, to consider our hard hands and dark color as God's mark of displeasure, and as pointing us out as the proper objects of slavery. Douglass, being Douglass, is able to pierce the veil of racist ideology in which slavery is clothed. He recognizes that, the Bible, or supposedly authoritative interpretations of it, notwithstanding, he is not a proper object of slavery, no one is. But such is the power of ideology and myth to make a contingent institution like slavery seem to be metaphysically necessary and ordained by God. I suspect that most readers will agree that the noble falsehood is in fact a true falsehood, rather than the beneficial verbal falsehood Socrates takes it to be, since it denies the fundamental equality of all persons. I should stress that to believe in human equality is not to believe that all humans are equally able to do calculus, hit a curveball, nurture their children, etc. It is not a belief in factual equality. It is a belief in moral equality, in the equal dignity of all persons. There are many places where the Republic butts up against deeply held but often implicit and perhaps unjustified beliefs many of us have. And though there are times when we are likely to arch our eyebrows and wonder if Plato is not really onto something in thinking as he does, I do not think this is one of those times.